30 retired military dogs were losing their minds inside a warehouse near the Charleston shipping docks. Barking, growling, pulling against their leads. Handlers were shouting. Security staff were moving nervously between kennels. Wealthy contractors stood back behind the barriers, trying to decide which dogs were worth buying and which ones were simply too damaged to be useful. Nobody in that building knew how to calm them down. Then a woman in wrinkled navy scrubs walked through a side entrance, and the noise stopped. Not gradually, not one kennel at a time. All at once, 30 dogs fell silent. The crowd looked around in confusion. The woman hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't touched a leash. She hadn't even stepped onto the auction floor. She simply looked toward the far corner of the warehouse where a scarred Belgian Malinois sat behind reinforced fencing. A red warning tag hung from the kennel door. High risk. Advanced handler required. The dog's name was Buster. 9 years old, retired military K9, multiple combat deployments, and according to the paperwork, one of the most difficult dogs in the entire auction. The woman stared at him for a moment and spoke 2 quiet words. Buster, stand down. The dog immediately sat. The warehouse went silent. Handlers froze. Security guards stopped moving. A retired Army colonel slowly lowered his coffee cup because the dog wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. He was looking at her. As if 6 years had never passed. As if he had been waiting for this exact moment. The woman was Ivy Morgan, a 31-year-old ER nurse who had just finished a 12-hour shift. She had less than $5,000 in savings. A coffee stain on her scrub top. And absolutely no idea that walking into this auction was about to drag her into a battle involving powerful businessmen, hidden contracts, threats, corruption, and a military secret that somebody desperately wanted buried. But none of that mattered to Buster, because after 6 years of searching, the only thing that mattered was that he had finally found his way back to someone he trusted. And what happened next would change both of their lives forever. A gray coastal rain drifted over Charleston's harbor, softening the cranes, warehouses, and shipping lights until the whole waterfront looked like an old battlefield trying to hide its scars. Inside Warehouse 19, near the edge of the Wando River docks, 30 retired military dogs were barking like the world had betrayed them for the last time. Their voices crashed against the metal walls, sharp and desperate, some deep with age, some cracked with fear, some carrying that strange wounded fury found only in creatures that had served faithfully and been left behind by people who preferred paperwork to memory. The warehouse had been cleaned for the event, or at least someone had tried. Industrial disinfectant floated over the heavier smell of stressed animals, wet concrete, machine oil, old salt, and human nerves. Temporary chain link pins divided the holding area from the auction floor. Fluorescent lights hummed above, bleaching every face pale and making the dog's eyes shine like small watchfires behind wire. Men in tailored jackets stood near the front rows, their shoes too polished for the docks. Retired officers lingered near the walls, quiet and stiff-backed. Men who had seen enough loud rooms to know when silence mattered more. Corporate security buyers checked tablets. Handlers in black polo shirts held leashes with both hands and pretended they were not afraid. Nobody in that building knew what to do with the noise. Then Ivy Morgan walked through the side door in wrinkled navy scrubs, and every dog in the room went silent. It did not happen like a miracle in a church painting, with golden lights spilling from the ceiling and angels leaning over the rafters. It happened more strangely than that. 1 second, the warehouse was chaos. The next, it was as still as a held breath. Ivy stopped just inside the door, rainwater darkening the shoulders of her scrub top, one hand still on the metal handle behind her. She was 31 years old, though exhaustion had a way of adding years around her eyes. She stood 5'6", lean but not fragile, with the wiry strength of someone who spent 12-hour shifts lifting patients, pushing stretchers, and carrying grief without permission to set it down. Her brown hair was pulled into a loose knot at the back of her head, strands escaping around a face that was more honest than pretty in any polished sense. Her skin had the warm olive tone of someone born under southern sun, though the hospital had robbed her of most daylight. There was a faint scar near her right eyebrow, thin and silver, a souvenir from a night overseas she rarely discussed. Her eyes were hazel, green in certain light, brown when she was tired, and today they looked like both. Tired enough to bend, stubborn enough not to break. A coffee stain marked the left pocket of her scrubs. She had noticed it only halfway across the Ravenel Bridge, and by then it had seemed foolish to turn back. She was not coming to impress rich men. She was coming for a dog. For 3 years, Ivy had worked in the emergency department at Coastal Memorial Medical Center, a busy Charleston hospital where the nights came in bleeding and left before anyone thanked them. Her co-workers knew her as calm, precise, and almost painfully reliable. She was not the loudest nurse in the trauma bay, never the one who filled silence with jokes just to make herself comfortable. Ivy moved like someone listening to the room with her whole body. If an elderly patient's breathing shifted, she heard it. If a frightened child stopped crying too suddenly, she noticed. If a doctor was about to miss something because pride was standing between his eyes and the truth, Ivy found a way to say the truth without turning the room into a battlefield. People trusted her because she rarely asked for trust. She simply did the work until trust arrived on its own. But outside the hospital, her life was smaller than most people imagined. She lived alone in a second-floor apartment above a closed antique shop in North Charleston, drove a 12-year-old Toyota with a rattling heater, and kept her savings in a separate account labeled Future, though most months the future looked suspiciously like rent, groceries, and car repairs. She had once been a military medic attached to a joint task force in the Middle East. She had come home 6 years earlier with steady hands, a nursing plan, and a heart full of rooms she refused to enter. One of those rooms had Buster in it. She had found him 3 weeks earlier on a veterans message board she still checked when she could not sleep. Most nights, the forum was full of job postings, disability questions, memorial notices, and dark jokes that would have sounded cruel to anyone who had not learned how humor survives where innocence does not. That night, at 2:14 in the morning, after a shift involving 2 overdoses, 1 stroke, and a 5-year-old with a Lego lodged in his nose who had screamed like a tiny opera singer betrayed by architecture, Ivy saw the post. Retired military working dog auction, Charleston, South Carolina, private buyers only. Sentinel Defense liquidation event. There were 26 attached images. She scrolled without meaning to care, then stopped so suddenly her thumb hurt. The photograph showed a Belgian Malinois seated behind chain link, wearing a heavy black muzzle. He was older than the dog she remembered, thicker through the neck, grayer around the muzzle, with a jagged pale scar running from the base of his left ear toward his jaw. One ear stood higher than the other. His amber eyes were fixed just beyond the camera, not wild, not blank, but measuring. He held his front legs square beneath him, shoulders slightly forward, weight ready to launch even while sitting. Ivy knew that posture before her mind could form the name. She whispered it into her dark kitchen. Buster. Buster had been 5 years old when Ivy last saw him. A dark sable Belgian Malinois with a black mask, sharp ears, and the intense dignity of a soldier who considered every human around him underqualified until proven otherwise. He had belonged to a handler named Staff Sergeant Caleb Ross, a broad-shouldered man from Tennessee with sandy hair, a crooked grin, and a habit of calling Buster sir whenever the dog ignored him. Caleb had been one of those men who used humor like a lantern in deep caves. He could make a joke while patching a tire under mortar fire, and he had once convinced an entire forward aid station that Buster needed an official birthday party for morale. But behind the jokes was a loyalty so fierce it made people better by standing near it. Ivy had served beside Caleb and Buster for 14 months. She had watched Buster detect buried explosives, locate wounded men, and stand guard outside a field surgery tent while the world cracked open around them. She had also watched him lean against Caleb's leg after long missions. All fire and fury turned suddenly into quiet devotion. Then came the ambush outside a village whose name Ivy still avoided saying. Caleb did not come home. Buster did, though something in him had stayed beside the road with his handler. After that, Buster disappeared into the system. Transferred for evaluation, someone said. Temporary reassignment, someone else said. Ivy was rotated out, then discharged, then home, then nursing school, then the long, slow labor of becoming a person civilians could understand. She told herself Buster had been placed with someone who knew what he needed. She told herself the military would not discard a dog who had saved lives. She told herself many things because grief is a skilled liar when it wants a tired heart to sleep. Then the auction listing appeared, and every lie fell dead at her feet. The description under his photo read, Male Belgian Malinois, age 9, former military working dog, behavioral concerns, advanced handler required, high-risk designation, sold as is, sold as is. Ivy had stared at those words until they blurred. As is was language for broken furniture, damaged appliances, cars with bad transmissions. Not for a dog who had stood between dying men and death. Not for Buster. She had $1,870 in savings that night. By the end of the next day, she had picked up 2 extra shifts. By the end of the week, 4. She ate cheap soup from the hospital cafeteria, canceled a dental cleaning, sold an old camera, returned a pair of winter boots she had bought on clearance, and ignored the small, sensible voice telling her that love did not pay auction bids. 14 months of careful saving became 3 weeks of desperate math. By the morning of the auction, Ivy had $4,380 available if she emptied everything except the rent money. She knew it would probably not be enough. She also knew that sometimes a person had to show up with what little they had, if only so heaven could not say they stayed home. The auction was being hosted by Sentinel Defense Group, a private security corporation whose glossy brochures promised strategic asset management for post-service operational resources. Ivy had read that phrase 3 times and disliked it more each time. Sentinel's Charleston event was by invitation and approved registration only, held in a converted shipping warehouse leased under the name Palmetto Maritime Storage. The company's founder, Victor Hale, was expected to attend. Ivy knew his name because everyone in the room seemed to know his name. He appeared near the front 15 minutes after she arrived, and the energy of the crowd shifted toward him like iron filings toward a magnet. Victor Hale was 52, tall and broad in the chest, with silver-black hair combed back from a hard, handsome face. His jaw was square, clean-shaven, and too still, as if emotion had to request permission before appearing there. His skin was lightly tanned, his suit charcoal, his watch expensive but not flashy. He had the polished calm of a man who had learned that money speaks more loudly when it does not raise its voice. People smiled when he passed. He offered them the exact amount of warmth required and not an ounce more. Ivy watched him shake hands with a retired general, clap a contractor on the shoulder, and glance toward the holding pens with the faintly bored expression of a man inspecting inventory. Something inside her went cold. At the registration table sat a young woman named Marlene Price, Sentinel's event coordinator, whose blonde bob was cut sharp at the chin and whose smile looked professionally installed. Marlene was small, neat, and anxious behind her polite voice, the kind of person who had learned to survive powerful rooms by keeping every paperclip aligned. She gave Ivy a bidder's badge, a numbered paddle, and a quick look that took in the scrubs, the tired eyes, the rain on her sleeves, and the absence of expensive jewelry. "Are you sure you're in the right place, Ms. Morgan?" Marlene asked softly. It was not cruel. That almost made it worse. "Yes," Ivy said. "Lot 17. Marlene's fingers hesitated on the clipboard. "Buster." Ivy nodded. Marlene's eyes flicked toward the far corner of the holding area, then back down. "You should read the behavioral notes before bidding." "I have. All of them." Ivy held her gaze. "Enough." Marlene swallowed, stamped the registration form, and slid the paddle across the table. "Then good luck." Her voice lowered slightly. "You may need it." Lot 17 was housed in the last pen on the left, away from the younger dogs and closer to a stack of shipping pallets that cast striped shadows over the concrete. Ivy did not approach it first. That was difficult. Every part of her wanted to go to him, kneel by the fence, say his name, and see whether memory still lived behind those amber eyes. But Buster was muzzled, tense, and surrounded by strangers who already believed he was dangerous. Love could be reckless. Ivy had learned that. But if love wanted to survive, it also had to be disciplined. So she stood 20 feet away, half hidden behind 2 men arguing about liability insurance, and looked. Buster was larger than she remembered, nearly 90 pounds, deep-chested and powerful despite the gray around his muzzle. His coat was dark fawn with black shading over his face and shoulders. The scar near his left ear had healed badly, raised and pale against the fur. A red tag hung from his pen. High risk. Do not approach. Advanced handler only. He was not barking. That frightened Ivy more than if he had been. The other dogs spent their fear outward. Buster held his inside like a grenade with the pin still in place. A handler stood near Buster's pen, a thick-necked man in his late 30s named Owen Klein, according to the badge clipped to his black polo. Owen had close-cropped brown hair, a sunburned face, and the restless jaw of someone chewing irritation instead of gum. He was not cruel in the theatrical way villains are cruel. He was worse in the ordinary way, impatient, undertrained, and embarrassed by his own fear. He kept glancing at Buster, then at the buyers, then at the leash hanging beside the pen door. His hands were broad and calloused, but they twitched whenever Buster shifted. Ivy had seen men like him in the service. Men who mistook control for competence and volume for authority. Men who could manage a calm dog and blame the dog when calm disappeared. Buster watched Owen without moving his head, only his eyes tracking him. That look made Ivy's throat tighten. It was the look of an animal who had already decided which humans could not be trusted. The auctioneer, a narrow man named Pierce Dalton, stepped onto the small platform at the front. Pierce was in his 60s, thin as a cane, with white hair, a red bow tie, and the brisk, cheerful voice of someone who could sell a cracked bucket as a rain collection system. He welcomed the bidders, thanked Sentinel Defense Group, praised the service records of the animals, and reminded everyone that all sales were final. His smile never reached his eyes. "These dogs," he said, "represent years of elite training, discipline, and operational value." Ivy heard no gratitude in the sentence. Only price. The first lots moved quickly. Younger dogs, 6 and 7 years old, with fewer red marks on their files, went to private ranch security companies and executive protection firms. Paddles rose. Numbers climbed. Buyers murmured. One German shepherd with cloudy eyes was sold to a quiet older couple from Virginia who looked like they might actually understand retirement as something gentler than repurposing. Ivy was grateful for that small mercy, but each bid made her savings feel smaller, almost childish. 3,000. 4,500. 6,000. 8. The numbers flew over her head like arrows. Victor Hale did not bid at first. He watched. That was somehow worse. He stood near the front beside a younger man with a tablet, speaking only occasionally, his expression calm and assessing. When he looked at a dog, he did not see age or fear or loyalty. Ivy could feel it from across the room. He saw application, usefulness, risk, return. She had spent years in hospitals and war zones watching how people looked at the vulnerable. There were those who saw a burden, those who saw a duty, and those rare few who saw a soul. Victor Hale saw assets. When Lot 13, a Dutch shepherd with a limp, came up, Victor made one short motion with his paddle and won the dog without even turning his head. The crowd accepted his victory as if gravity had done it. Ivy thought of kings in old stories claiming forests, rivers, beasts, and men simply because no one dared tell them they were not gods. Then Pierce Dalton cleared his throat. Lot 17. A murmur moved through the warehouse. Not loud, but alive. Owen Klein opened Buster's pen with another handler standing behind him, just in case. Buster stepped out slowly. His muzzle was strapped tight. His leash was short. His head stayed level, ears forward, body controlled with such precision that the untrained might have mistaken it for calm. Ivy did not. Calm had softness somewhere in it. This was containment. This was a storm choosing its shape. As Owen led him toward the center of the auction floor, Buster's paws made no sound on the concrete. That, too, Ivy remembered. He had always moved like a shadow with teeth. Pierce read from the card. Buster, male Belgian Malinois, age 9, former military working dog, multiple overseas deployments, decommissioned after behavioral assessment, requires experienced handler, full records available upon transfer. He paused, glanced toward Victor Hale, then continued. Opening bid, $3,000. Ivy raised her paddle before fear could talk her out of it. A few heads turned. Someone behind her gave a soft laugh, not quite mocking, but close. Another paddle rose. Then another. 3,500, Pierce called. Ivy raised again. 4,000. Her heart knocked once hard. That was almost everything. A man in a brown sport coat lifted his paddle. 4,500. Ivy's hand stayed down. Heat crawled up her neck. She had known this might happen. Knowing did not make it merciful. The bid climbed to 5,000, then 6. The man in the sport coat dropped out. For one ridiculous second, Ivy thought it might end there. Then Victor Hale raised his paddle. He did not lift it high. He barely moved his wrist. But the room noticed. Pierce's voice brightened. 7,000 from Mr. Hale. Ivy felt the number land like a door closing. Someone bid 7,500. Victor answered with 8. Another bidder tried 85. Victor said 10,000, and the attempt died immediately. The warehouse settled into that strange silence people keep around money when money has already won. Pierce looked around the room. 10,000. Do I hear 11? Ivy stared at Buster. He stood beside Owen, still as carved stone, amber eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd. He had not seen her. Or if he had, he gave no sign. For a moment, a cruel thought slipped into Ivy's mind. Maybe he did not remember. Maybe the dog she had known was gone, worn down by 6 years of transfers, muzzles, handlers, cages, and human disappointment. Maybe she had come too late with too little. Pierce raised the gavel. Sold, $10,000, to Sentinel Defense Group. The sound of the gavel was small. Ivy heard it anyway. Something in her chest folded inward, not breaking, exactly, but changing shape under pressure. She lowered her paddle. Her fingers were stiff. Around her, people shifted, checked phones, prepared for the next lot. To them, the moment had ended. To Ivy, it had opened like a wound. Owen tugged Buster's leash too sharply to turn him back toward the holding pens. Buster's head moved a fraction. His body stiffened. Ivy saw it before anyone else did. The small transfer of weight. The tightening through the shoulders. The breath that stopped halfway in. Don't pull him like that, she whispered, though nobody heard. Owen pulled again, irritated now, perhaps embarrassed that the dog had not responded quickly enough in front of buyers. Move, he snapped. Buster did move. Not backward. Forward. The leash went taut. Owen braced himself. For 1 second, they were locked in a silent contest. One man trying to drag, one dog deciding whether the world was about to become dangerous. Then someone dropped a metal clipboard behind the pens. The crash rang through the warehouse like a gunshot. Several dogs exploded into barking. A woman gasped. Owen jerked the leash with both hands. Buster lunged. The handle slipped through Owen's fingers. A second handler grabbed too late. The leash slapped the concrete. And then Buster was free. Chaos arrived like a beast of its own. Buyers stumbled backward. Security shouted. Someone yelled, "Get him down." Another voice screamed, "Don't shoot," though Ivy had not seen a gun. Chairs scraped. Pierce Dalton retreated behind the auction podium with surprising speed for a man who looked assembled from dry sticks. Owen Klein froze for half a heartbeat, then shouted Buster's name in a voice full of panic and anger, which was the worst possible mixture. Buster ignored him. The dog ran across the auction floor, 90 pounds of muscle, scar tissue, memory, and decision. He was not running randomly. Ivy saw that immediately. He was running toward the back of the room. Toward her. A security guard reached for Ivy's arm. He was young, maybe 25, with a shaved head and frightened eyes. "Ma'am, move back." She pulled free. Not violently. Simply with the absolute refusal of someone who had made her choice before the world began shouting. Her body remembered before her mind did. Feet shoulder-width apart. Knees soft. Hands visible. Breath low. The warehouse blurred at the edges. For a moment, she was not in Charleston. She was under a white-hot sky far away, dust in her mouth, rotor blades beating the air, Caleb Ross laughing once and saying, "Don't worry, Ivy. Buster only judges people with poor character." Then Caleb was gone. The sky was gone. Only Buster remained, charging straight at her, muzzle strapped around his jaws, eyes burning. Ivy did not shout. She did not plead. She did not reach for him. She used the voice she had used in war zones and trauma rooms. The voice that left fear no chair to sit in. "Buster, stand down." The dog stopped 4 feet from her. Not stumbled. Not crashed. Stopped. Clean and exact. As if an invisible line had appeared on the concrete. His weight shifted back. His ears rose. His breathing filled the silence, rough through the muzzle. The entire warehouse froze with him. Ivy's heart was pounding so hard it seemed impossible no one heard it. Buster stared at her face. His eyes moved once, tracing her brow, her mouth, the scar near her eyebrow, the tired shape of a woman he had last known under another sun. Something changed in him then. Not much. Just enough. The fury did not vanish. The fear did not vanish. But underneath both, recognition opened like a door in a ruined house. Slowly, Buster sat. No one moved. The old generals near the wall stood motionless. Victor Hale's face hardened, the first true emotion Ivy had seen on it. Owen Klein looked humiliated and pale. Pierce Dalton held his gavel against his chest like a church relic. 30 dogs, moments ago wild with sound, remained silent behind the pens. Ivy crouched, careful and slow, lowering herself to Buster's level. "Hey, old man," she whispered. Her voice almost failed on the last word. Buster leaned forward until the front of his muzzle touched her open palm. The contact was small, awkward through the rubber, and more devastating than any embrace. Ivy closed her fingers lightly around the side of his face, not restraining him, just letting him feel the shape of a hand that remembered. "I'm sorry," she breathed. "I looked too late." Buster did not understand the words. Or maybe he understood more than people liked to admit. He pressed closer. His body trembled, not with aggression, but with the terrible strain of holding himself together after years of being called unstable by people who had never bothered to ask what he had survived. Ivy felt tears rise and force them down. Not here. Not in front of men who would mistake grief for weakness and weakness for ownership. She stood slowly. Buster rose with her and moved to her left side, settling at her heel as naturally as if no time had passed at all. Victor Hale stepped forward. His expression was calm again, but the calm had a blade under it. "Secure the dog," he said. His voice carried across the warehouse, low and controlled. 2 security men moved, then hesitated when Buster turned his head toward them. Ivy did not look away from Victor. Up close, his eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and his mouth held the faint displeasure of a man inconvenienced by another person's humanity. "Ms. Morgan," he said, having apparently learned her name from registration, "you are interfering with purchased property." Ivy's hand rested near Buster's shoulder, not touching now, but close enough that he knew where she was. "He isn't property." Victor's smile was small and cold. "Everything in this warehouse is property under contract." Ivy felt the whole room listening. She also felt Buster trembling beside her, a vibration so fine it would be invisible to anyone watching from 10 feet away. "He's scared," she said. Victor glanced at the dog. "He's dangerous." Those are not the same thing. For a second, the words hung there, simple and almost foolish against all that money, all that paperwork, all those contracts and badges and polished shoes. Yet something in the room shifted. One of the retired officers near the wall lowered his chin. Marlene Price stopped typing at the registration table. Owen Klein looked at the floor. Victor Hale's face did not change, but Ivy saw the calculation behind his eyes. He was not used to being challenged by someone in stained scrubs with less money than his watch. He was even less used to being challenged in a way that made the room consider whether she was right. "You lost the bid," Victor said. "Yes," Ivy answered. "You do not have standing." "Maybe not." "Then step away from my dog." Buster's ears flicked at the phrase "my dog," and a low sound rose in his chest, not a growl exactly, more like thunder remembering itself. Ivy gave the smallest motion with her left hand. Buster quieted. Victor noticed. Everyone noticed. The silence deepened until even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their breath. Ivy knew, in that moment, that she had no legal weapon, no money, no plan large enough to match the danger she had stepped into. She had come with $4,000 and a memory. That was all. But Buster stood beside her as if she were still the medic who had knelt in dust beside wounded men while he guarded the perimeter. He had chosen her in front of everyone. And choice, she thought, was a sacred thing when it came from a creature who had been given so few. Before Victor could speak again, an older man near the far wall straightened. Ivy had noticed him only vaguely before, one of the quiet retired officers standing apart from the buyers. He was tall, perhaps in his late 60s, with a weathered face, close-cut white hair, and a neatly trimmed gray beard that followed the line of a square jaw. He wore a plain brown jacket, dark jeans, and boots scuffed by real use rather than fashion. His eyes were deep blue and tired, not weak tired, but old war tired, the kind that comes from remembering names after everyone else has moved on to numbers. He had the stillness of a man who had once commanded storms and no longer needed to prove he could raise his voice. His name was Colonel Benjamin Carter, though Ivy did not know it yet. When he stepped forward, people made room without being asked. Victor saw him and went very still, and that was where the first true crack appeared in the room's armor. Colonel Benjamin Carter did not hurry when he crossed the auction floor. Men like Victor Hale built their power on speed, pressure, and the assumption that ordinary people would step aside before they understood what was happening. Benjamin moved differently. He came forward with the slow certainty of a man who had outlived too many alarms to be frightened by noise. He was 6'2", broad through the shoulders though age had carved some weight from him, with close-cut white hair, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and weathered skin lined by desert sun, ocean wind, and old command decisions. His eyes were deep blue and steady, but not soft. They had the look of eyes that had once counted men into helicopters and later counted fewer men out. He wore no uniform, no medals, no visible sign of rank beyond the posture that rank had left behind. A plain brown jacket hung from his frame, and his boots had dried mud along the edges, as if he had come from somewhere real and not from the polished world of private security contracts. Victor Hale saw him coming, and, for the first time since Ivy had entered Warehouse 19, the man's confidence lost half a shade of color. "Colonel Carter," Victor said. The title moved through the room like a match struck in darkness. A few of the retired officers near the wall straightened. Marlene Price looked up sharply from the registration table. Owen Klein, still red-faced from losing control of Buster, stopped pretending to adjust his leash and stared. Ivy felt Buster shift beside her, not lunging, not threatening, only recognizing the change in the room's breathing. The old dog's body remained close to her left leg, his muzzle angled forward, amber eyes moving from Victor to Benjamin with the wary intelligence of a creature who had learned that the most dangerous fights often began with polite voices. Benjamin did not look at Victor first. He looked at Buster. For one long moment, the old colonel's face did not move. Then something in his jaw tightened, so slight most people would have missed it. Ivy did not. She had worked emergency rooms long enough to know when pain arrived silently. Benjamin had recognized the dog not as a lot number, not as a risk category, not as inventory, but as someone who had returned from a place where good things were rarely allowed to return whole. "Buster," Benjamin said. The dog's ears lifted. Ivy's breath caught. Benjamin stopped several feet away, careful not to crowd either Ivy or the dog. His voice lowered, no longer meant for the room, but the room listened anyway. "You old thunderhead," he murmured. "They told me you were gone." Buster did not move from Ivy's side, but his head tilted. A faint tremor passed through his shoulders, the kind of response that lived somewhere below training and above instinct. Recognition, Ivy thought. Not complete, not simple. Memory had no clean shape in creatures that had survived too much. It came in fragments, a voice, a smell, a posture, a command spoken by someone who had once stood on the right side of danger. Victor Hale stepped between them with the measured irritation of a man reclaiming a stage. "Colonel, whatever personal history you may have with this animal, the sale has concluded." Benjamin finally looked at him. "Has it?" Pierce Dalton, the auctioneer, cleared his throat from behind the podium. Pierce had regained enough composure to smooth his bow tie, though his thin fingers still shook. The gavel fell, "Colonel. Lot 17 was awarded to Sentinel Defense Group for $10,000. "Awarded," Benjamin repeated. His voice did not rise. That made the word heavier. Victor smiled in the small, controlled way Ivy had already come to dislike. "This is a private auction operating under contract. If you have concerns, I'm sure Mr. Dalton can direct you to the appropriate post-sale inquiry process." "I'm sure he can," Benjamin said. "But I have concerns that belong before the sale, not after." Marlene Price's face went pale. It lasted only a second, but Ivy saw it. Marlene's professionally installed smile disappeared, revealing a young woman frightened by something she had known might happen but had prayed would not. She was perhaps 28, pretty in a brittle way, with pale skin, blue eyes, and the careful posture of an employee who had spent too long surviving under powerful men by pretending she never noticed the cracks in their stories. She lowered her gaze to the clipboard in front of her, but her fingers had stopped moving. Victor noticed too. His eyes flicked toward her, sharp as a blade sliding from a sleeve. Benjamin reached inside his jacket and removed a folded document. He did not hand it to Victor. He held it at his side like a man who had not yet decided whether the room deserved the courtesy of paper. "Before Lot 17 is removed from this floor," Benjamin said, "I want the complete custodianship file reviewed." Pierce Dalton gave a nervous laugh. Colonel, all available documentation has already been reviewed by qualified parties. Available documentation is not the same as complete documentation. Victor's smile disappeared. Careful. The word was quiet, but it changed the temperature. Ivy felt Buster's muscles tighten. She gave the smallest touch to the fur behind his shoulder, barely more than a whisper of contact. He stilled, but the tremor remained inside him. She knew that tremor. She had seen it in veterans who sat with their backs to restaurant walls. She had felt it in her own hands when fireworks cracked above Charleston on the 4th of July, and everyone around her cheered like thunder, had no memory. Buster was not preparing to attack because he wanted violence. He was preparing because every human in the room was teaching him that danger was coming. Benjamin glanced at Ivy. His eyes softened by a fraction, though his face remained stern. You knew Caleb Ross. It was not a question. It struck Ivy so hard, she almost forgot to breathe. Yes, she said. Victor looked between them. Who? Benjamin ignored him. You were attached to Ross's element during the Almazir extraction rotation. The name of the operation moved through Ivy like cold water. She had not heard it spoken aloud in years. Her mind flashed, pale dust spinning behind rotor blades, a stretcher strapped slick with blood, Caleb's hand on Buster's collar, Buster's ears sharp against a burnt orange sky. She swallowed. 14 months, Ivy said. I was a combat medic before nursing school. Benjamin studied her with the quiet attention of a man placing a final piece into a painful puzzle. I thought I recognized you from the incident report. I was younger then. We all were. For 1 second, something like grief passed between them, not shared exactly, but understood. Then Victor cut through it. This reunion is touching, he said, but it has no bearing on ownership. Benjamin turned back to him. It has bearing on provenance. The word landed with more force than Ivy expected. Pierce Dalton stiffened. Marlene's face dropped another shade. Victor's eyes narrowed. Explain. Benjamin unfolded the paper. Buster was assigned to Staff Sergeant Caleb Ross under Joint Task Force Medical Extraction Support. After Ross was killed, Buster was transferred to Fort Benning for rehabilitation review. From there, according to the file provided by Sentinel, he moved through 3 facilities before being listed for private liquidation. He lifted his gaze. That chain has gaps. Pierce stepped forward, trying to rescue the room with procedure. Colonel, decommissioned working dogs often pass through multiple agencies and contracted facilities. It's not unusual for paperwork to be messy, Benjamin asked. Pierce hesitated. Conveniently incomplete? Benjamin continued. Victor's voice hardened. You're making accusations without authority. Benjamin folded the paper once, carefully. No, I'm asking for a pause before a disputed asset is transferred. Your own terms allow it. Marlene's head lifted. Victor turned toward her slowly. Miss Price. Marlene looked as if she had been called to testify before a judge she feared and respected in equal measure. She pushed a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. Section 9, she said quietly. Post-gavel transfer may be delayed if credible provenance dispute is raised before removal from the premises. The warehouse fell silent again, but this silence had teeth. Victor stared at her. That applies to equipment. It applies to all listed assets, Marlene said, and her voice barely held steady. Ivy looked at the young woman with sudden, unexpected pity. Marlene was not brave in the shining way stories like to describe courage. She was afraid. Anyone could see that. But she had told the truth anyway, and sometimes truth spoken through fear was stronger than truth spoken by the fearless. Victor turned back to Benjamin. You came prepared. I came suspicious. You always were. And you always disliked being questioned. A few people in the room shifted. There was history there. Ivy could feel it, old and sour. Victor stepped closer, his polished shoes soundless on the concrete. You left the service years ago, Colonel. This is not your command. No, Benjamin said. If it were, this dog would not be wearing a muzzle in an auction warehouse. The words hit Ivy somewhere deep. Buster leaned against her leg, not heavily, just enough to remind her he was real. Victor's face hardened into something colder than anger. Sentinel Defense acquired these animals legally through approved channels. Then you won't object to review. I object to interference. Those are different, Benjamin said. Ivy almost smiled despite everything. It was the echo of her own words. and for a strange second the two of them stood like bookends around a truth the room had been trying not to see. Victor looked toward the security guards. "Remove the dog from the floor." Buster's head came up. Ivy's pulse slammed. "Don't." Owen Klein grabbed for the leash lying near Buster's feet, but Benjamin's voice stopped him. "Touched that dog wrong," the colonel said, "and every retired officer in this room will write a statement before sunset." Owen froze. The retired men near the wall did not speak, but several stepped forward. One of them was short and heavy-set with dark skin, a shaved head, and a cane held in his right hand like it had once been a swagger stick. Another was tall and narrow, with silver hair and a hearing aid, his mouth set in the grim line of a man who had spent his life obeying rules and had no patience for people who abused them. They did not need introductions. Their silence became a wall. Victor understood walls. He had built enough of them. "What do you want?" he asked Benjamin. "A 24-hour hold on transfer," Benjamin said. "Full custodianship review. All facility records from the date of decommissioning to today. Handler incident logs. Medical evaluations. Behavioral assessments. Transportation receipts. Contract acquisition trail." "That is absurd. That is documentation. This is harassment. This is Section 9. Pierce Dalton looked like he wanted to disappear into his bow tie. Victor's gaze moved to Ivy. "And what is she in this? A witness? A claimant? A sentimental complication?" Ivy felt the room turn toward her. For a moment, she wanted to step backward, not from fear of Victor exactly, but from the old habit of being invisible when powerful men decided the shape of events. She had spent years becoming useful in rooms where rank mattered. She had learned how to speak only when necessary, how to save lives without demanding the story afterward. But Buster pressed closer to her knee, and the warmth of him steadied her. "I'm the person he ran to," Ivy said. It was not legal language. It was not enough to win a contract. But it was true, and the truth had a way of standing taller than expected when spoken plainly. Benjamin nodded once. "She is also a former service member with direct operational history involving this dog. That makes her relevant to any rehabilitation or custodianship review." Victor gave a short laugh. "She came here with a nurse's paycheck and nostalgia." Ivy said nothing, but shame pricked at her skin. He had found the wound and pressed it. A nurse's paycheck. For $1,000. A coffee stain. A used car waiting outside in the rain. She felt, for one ugly second, exactly as small as Victor wanted her to feel. Then Benjamin spoke, not loudly, but with a command that pulled every eye back to him. "Careful, Mr. Hale. Some of the best people I ever knew came with nothing but a medic bag and the courage to walk toward screaming." Ivy looked down because if she looked at him too long, she might cry, and she refused to give Victor the satisfaction of misunderstanding tears. Victor's mouth tightened. 24 hours, he said at last. "But the dog remains in sentinel custody during review." "No," Benjamin said. Victor's eyes flashed. "No. He remains on site under neutral restraint until documentation is reviewed, or he is transferred to temporary veterinary custody. That is not your decision. It becomes the safest decision once the auction floor witnesses have seen your handler lose physical control of him." Owen's face reddened further. "That wasn't." "Quiet," Victor said. Owen obeyed. Benjamin looked toward Marlene. "Is there a veterinary representative present?" Marlene nodded quickly, almost grateful to be given a factual question. "Dr. Keene is in the rear office. He signed the health clearances." "Bring him." Victor inhaled slowly through his nose. Ivy could almost hear the machinery behind his expression, calculating cost, optics, risk. A room full of witnesses. A retired colonel raising a provenance dispute. A high-risk dog who had visibly obeyed a former medic instead of sentinel staff. A handler who had lost control. None of it looked good. Men like Victor did not fear wrongdoing. They feared bad leverage. Marlene hurried toward the office behind the holding pens. A minute later, she returned with a veterinarian in his late 50s named Dr. Amos Keene. He was a compact man with rounded shoulders, thinning black hair streaked with gray, and kind, tired brown eyes behind wire-framed glasses. His white coat was wrinkled at the sleeves, and a stethoscope hung around his neck as if it had become part of him. He had the gentle manner of someone who liked animals better than negotiations and had spent most of the day regretting he had agreed to be present. When he saw Buster standing at Ivy's heel, his eyebrows rose. "Well," Dr. Keene said softly, That's interesting. Victor snapped. Doctor, is this dog safe for temporary veterinary custody? Dr. Keene looked at Buster, then at Ivy, then at Benjamin. He did not answer quickly, which Ivy appreciated. Quick answers often serve the person asking, not the truth. With her, Dr. Keene said, nodding toward Ivy. Possibly. Victor's jaw flexed. That is not what I asked. It is the answer I can give honestly. A small breath moved through the room. Almost a laugh, almost relief. Dr. Keene stepped closer, stopping when Buster's ears angled toward him. May I? He asked Ivy. The question startled her. No one had asked her permission all day. She nodded. Slowly, Dr. Keene crouched with care, keeping his hands visible and his eyes soft. He did not reach for Buster. He simply observed the dog's breathing, posture, and the tremor running through his hindquarters. He's overstimulated, the veterinarian said. Not actively aggressive right now. Fear response, high control. The muzzle should stay on until he is removed from the crowd, but I would not recommend Sentinel staff attempt another direct handoff. Owen muttered something under his breath. Dr. Keene ignored him with the seasoned dignity of a man who had survived many foolish handlers. Benjamin said, Can he be transported safely with Ms. Morgan accompanying? Dr. Keene glanced at Ivy again. If she has prior handling experience and the dog remains responsive to her commands, yes. Short transport. Quiet environment. No crowding. Victor's voice sharpened. This is outrageous. No, Dr. Keene said, surprising everyone, perhaps himself most of all. Outrageous was bringing a dog with this level of combat history into a crowded auction floor. Silence struck again. Dr. Keene stood slowly, adjusting his glasses. His face had gone pale, but he did not take the words back. Ivy wondered what had made him say it. Maybe he had a son in the service. Maybe he had signed too many papers that felt wrong. Maybe everyone had a line, and Buster had dragged the room across his. Benjamin seized the moment before fear could undo it. Temporary veterinary custody. 24-hour documentation hold. Ms. Morgan accompanies transport. I will provide written notice of provenance dispute and assume responsibility for legal review. Victor looked at Benjamin for several long seconds. Then his eyes shifted to Ivy. You think this is over because a retired colonel knows how to make noise? Ivy did not answer. Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice enough that only Ivy, Benjamin, and perhaps Buster could hear. You are walking into a world you do not understand. Buster gave one low rumble. Ivy's hand brushed his shoulder again. Maybe, she said, but I understand him. For the first time, Victor's mask cracked into open anger. It vanished almost immediately, but Ivy saw it. So did Benjamin. Victor turned away. File your paperwork, Colonel. You have 24 hours. Benjamin said, No. I have until the documentation is complete. Victor stopped. Section 9 does not specify 24 hours, Benjamin continued. You offered 24. I declined. We will review what needs reviewing. Marlene looked down at the clipboard to hide whatever expression crossed her face. Victor did not turn back around. You will regret this. Benjamin's voice was quiet. I regret many things, Mr. Hale. Doing right by a dog who saved American soldiers will not be one of them. That ended the auction more completely than any gavel could have. The next hour unfolded in careful, tense pieces. Dr. Keene arranged for Buster to be moved to a small veterinary clinic across town under temporary custody. A stocky female animal transport officer named Denise Calder arrived from the clinic with a reinforced van. Denise was in her 40s, with copper-brown skin, muscular arms, and gray-streaked black hair braided tightly down her back. She had a no-nonsense expression and the rare gift of making animals trust her by not demanding it. Nobody crowds him, she said the moment she entered. Nobody grabs. Nobody plays hero. I hate paperwork and bite reports equally. For the first time that day, Ivy almost laughed. Buster allowed himself to be guided only because Ivy walked beside him. The leash remained loose in her hand. He did not pull. He did not bark. He moved through the warehouse with stiff dignity, past buyers who no longer looked at him like merchandise. Some looked ashamed. Some looked annoyed. Some looked away because looking too closely might cost them something inside themselves. At the door, Ivy glanced back once. Victor Hale stood near the podium, phone pressed to his ear, eyes fixed on her with a cold promise. She had seen men angry before. She had seen men dangerous before. Victor was both, but with money wrapped around him like armor. Outside, the rain had thinned to mist. The harbor smelled of salt and diesel. Buster paused at the open doors of the transport van, his body tightening at the dark enclosed space. Ivy felt him hesitate and understood instantly. Too many crates. Too many transfers. Too many doors closing behind him. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I know," she whispered. "I know, buddy. But this time I'm coming with you." He looked at her. There was no magic in it. No perfect healing. No instant trust that erased 6 years of abandonment. Buster was still afraid. Ivy was afraid too. But he climbed into the van. She climbed in after him. Benjamin stood outside with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching as Denise secured the outer gate. The old colonel's face was unreadable, but his eyes held the weary satisfaction of a man who had won only the first inch of a very long mile. Ivy looked through the van's mesh window. "Why did you help us?" Benjamin did not answer right away. Rain gathered in silver beads along his jacket collar. "Because I was there when Buster earned better than this," he said. The words settled between them. Then Denise closed the van door, and Warehouse 19 disappeared behind metal and mist. The veterinary clinic sat 12 miles inland from the Charleston docks, tucked behind a line of live oaks whose wet branches hung over the parking lot like old hands trying to hide the building from the road. Palmetto Animal Emergency was not beautiful, but it was clean, warm, and quiet in the way places become quiet when the people inside understand fear. Ivy noticed that first. No shouting. No sharp metal clatter. No crowded auction floor. No men in expensive suits looking at Buster as if he were a damaged machine waiting for resale. Just pale walls, soft lights, the distant beep of a monitor, and a receptionist who looked up from her desk, saw the muzzled Belgian Malinois beside Ivy, and wisely decided not to make a sound. Denise Calder walked ahead of them with the confident calm of a woman who had handled frightened animals, angry owners, and city inspectors before breakfast. "Room 3, she said, pointing down the hall. "No crowd. No sudden hands. Let him choose his corner." Ivy guided Buster into the exam room with the leash loose in her fingers. The old dog stepped inside, stopped, swept the room with his eyes, then backed into the corner where 2 walls met. He sat there with his scarred head raised, his muzzle still strapped on, his body saying what his voice did not. "I will stay, but I do not yet believe this place is safe." Ivy did not blame him. Trust, once broken by too many doors, did not return just because someone opened the right one. She lowered herself onto the floor several feet away, ignoring the chair. Her knees ached from standing through the auction and the ride, and her scrubs smelled like rain, hospital antiseptic, and warehouse dust. She had been awake for nearly 20 hours. A reasonable person would have asked for coffee, a legal update, maybe a place to wash her face. Ivy did none of those things. She simply sat where Buster could see her and rested her hands open on her thighs. He watched her without blinking. There was something holy and terrible in that kind of attention. It was not affection yet. It was not peace. It was a wounded creature measuring whether the woman in front of him was real, whether she would vanish like every other familiar thing had vanished. Dr. Amos Keene entered 10 minutes later carrying a clipboard and a paper cup of water for Ivy. He had removed his white coat, perhaps to make himself look less clinical, and now wore a faded green shirt with a tiny embroidered turtle near the pocket. Without the coat, he looked smaller and older, but kinder too. "Drink," he said, handing the cup to Ivy. "That's a medical recommendation, not a suggestion." Ivy took it. "I'm the nurse here." "Then you know nurses are the worst patients." Denise, standing near the door with her arms crossed, snorted. For a moment, the joke floated softly through the room, absurd and human, and Ivy felt her chest loosen by a fraction. Buster did not move, but one ear twitched, as if he were cataloging humor as a low-level risk. Dr. Keene crouched near the opposite wall, careful to keep his body angled away from Buster. "I'm going to leave the muzzle on for now," he said. "Not because I think he's bad, but because fear can make good animals do sudden things. I want to give him time." Ivy nodded. "Thank you." The veterinarian glanced at her. "You don't need to thank me for not being stupid." Denise said, "That should be on the clinic sign." Dr. Keene smiled faintly, then returned his attention to Buster. "He has pressure sores under the strap line, mild dehydration, old scar tissue. I'll need radiographs eventually, blood work, a full neurological check, dental exam, and a behavioral assessment by someone who actually understands working dogs. But not tonight." Tonight, he needs quiet, water, and one person he trusts. His eyes moved to Ivy. That appears to be you. The words landed gently but heavily. One person he trusts. Ivy looked at Buster, and guilt rose in her so sharply that it almost became anger. 6 years. She had gone to nursing school. She had built schedules, paid bills, smiled at patients, learned the names of coworkers' children, and told herself she was moving forward. Meanwhile, Buster had been passed from one facility to another, labeled, muzzled, mishandled, and finally placed under fluorescent lights for sale. She had not caused it. She knew that. But guilt did not always care about logic. Sometimes it only cared that love had arrived late. Benjamin Carter arrived after nightfall with a folder under one arm and rain shining in the seams of his jacket. The clinic had emptied except for emergency staff. He stepped into the exam room and paused at the sight of Ivy on the floor and Buster in the corner, both of them silent, both exhausted, both guarding something they could not name. Benjamin's expression softened for half a heartbeat. Then the soldier returned. "We have a problem," he said. Ivy almost laughed because, at that point, the sentence felt unnecessarily modest. Benjamin explained that Sentinel sale documents were less clean than Victor Hale had claimed. The transfer chain listed Buster leaving federal custody through a rehabilitation contractor in Georgia, then moving to a private working dog assessment facility in Alabama, then to Sentinel's liquidation inventory. But between those steps were blank periods. For months unaccounted for after Georgia, 7 weeks missing before Alabama, and no signed behavioral review from the final facility. A dog with Buster's record doesn't simply drift through custody gaps, Benjamin said. He stood near the counter, broad hands resting on the folder, his jaw shadowed with white stubble now that the day had stretched long. Somebody either lost the paperwork, buried the paperwork, or changed the paperwork. Denise leaned against the doorframe. "Which one do you think?" Benjamin looked at Buster. "I think people only hide records when the truth costs them money." Ivy asked the question she had been avoiding. "Can Victor still take him?" Benjamin did not answer immediately. That frightened her more than a quick yes or no. "He can try," he said. "The sale is paused, not destroyed. I filed the dispute. Dr. Keene filed a welfare concern. Marlene Price logged the Section 9 hold before Victor could pressure her into pretending it did not exist. That gives us time. How much? Maybe 48 hours. Maybe less, if Sentinel's attorneys move fast." Ivy looked down at her hands. There was dried grime beneath her nails from the warehouse floor. "I don't have money for a legal fight." Benjamin's voice changed, not warmer exactly, but lower. "I know." She looked up. "Then why are you helping?" He sighed through his nose, and for the first time he seemed not old, but deeply tired of surviving the same failures in new uniforms. "Because I commanded men who were alive because that dog stood his ground. Because Caleb Ross died trusting the system would take care of his partner. Because I should have checked sooner." His eyes held hers. "And because you walked into that warehouse when everyone else was content to watch." For several seconds, Ivy could not speak. Praise made her uncomfortable, mercy even more so. In the emergency room, gratitude came fast and messy, then vanished with discharge papers. This was different. This was someone seeing the shape of her choice and naming it. She wanted to deny it, shrink it, make it practical. Instead, she said, "I only had $4,000. Benjamin's mouth moved like it almost remembered how to smile. David only had a sling. Denise glanced between them. "I'm not religious, Colonel, but if that dog is Goliath, we're all in trouble." Ivy startled herself by laughing once, a small cracked sound. Even Buster's head tilted. Benjamin opened the folder and slid several pages onto the counter. "I've contacted an attorney in Savannah named Rebecca Stone. She handles military animal custody disputes, veterans' benefits appeals, and the sort of paperwork that makes powerful men develop headaches. She owes me one favor and dislikes companies like Sentinel on principle." Ivy blinked. "Savannah? That's where the temporary foster transfer can be filed fastest. Georgia has a nonprofit rehabilitation partner willing to sponsor the application. Your apartment is there, correct?" Ivy hesitated. "It's not exactly an apartment people brag about. Does it have a door that locks?" "Usually." Denise raised an eyebrow. Ivy added, "The deadbolt sticks when it rains." "Fix it," Denise said. "Big dog. Bigger enemies. Sticky deadbolt is how horror movies start." Again, Ivy almost laughed. Again, The humor felt like a match struck in a cave. Ivy had lived in Savannah for 2 years while commuting blocks of shifts in Charleston, a strange arrangement born from nursing contracts, cheaper rent, and the quiet need to place a river and 2 hours of highway between herself and memories that clung too tightly to Charleston's military circles. Her apartment was small, above a bakery that filled the stairwell with the smell of sugar every morning. She had chosen it because the windows faced a live oak instead of another wall, and because the landlord, Mrs. Elaine Whitcomb, was a widowed schoolteacher who believed quiet tenants were gifts from God. Ivy imagined explaining Buster to her. A scarred, muzzled retired military dog with a high-risk tag. A legal dispute. Possible corporate retaliation. Mrs. Whitcomb was 73, thin as a hymn book, with silver curls and a habit of calling everyone baby, even when angry. She would either faint or ask whether Buster preferred chicken. Benjamin continued. If Dr. Keene signs a temporary medical custody recommendation and Rebecca files the emergency petition tomorrow morning, Buster can leave Sentinel's reach while the records are reviewed. You would be listed as provisional custodian under nonprofit supervision. Meaning he comes home with me? Ivy asked. The words felt too dangerous to say loudly. Benjamin nodded. If the petition is accepted. Ivy looked at Buster. The dog had lowered his head onto his paws, but had not closed his eyes. He was still watching them. And if it isn't? Benjamin's face hardened. Then Victor gets another chance to claim him. The room grew quiet. Even Denise stopped making jokes. Dr. Keene returned with a shallow bowl of water and placed it halfway between Ivy and Buster before backing away. Buster stared at it, then at Ivy. It's okay, she said softly. He waited another moment, then rose and approached the bowl, each step careful. He drank slowly at first, then deeper, the sound painfully ordinary. Ivy felt tears behind her eyes again. There was something unbearable about watching a warrior perform a simple act of need. Buster finished, lifted his head, and water dripped from the edge of the muzzle. Ivy reached for a towel, then stopped, letting him decide. After a moment, he stepped close enough for her to wipe his chin through the bars of the muzzle. The trust was small. It was everything. The paperwork took until nearly midnight. Ivy signed forms on a metal exam table while Benjamin made calls in a low voice from the hallway. Dr. Keene wrote his medical note with slow, exact care, refusing to exaggerate, but refusing to soften the truth. Denise prepared a transport plan for morning. Marlene Price, still at Warehouse 19, emailed the Section 9 hold log from her personal account after Benjamin told her to preserve a copy somewhere Sentinel could not erase. Ivy never heard Marlene's voice, but she imagined the young woman sitting in a bright office under Victor's shadow, hands shaking over a keyboard, choosing whether to obey fear or truth. It was strange how many quiet acts had to align for one abandoned dog to have a chance. At 12:17 a.m., Benjamin ended a call and returned to the exam room. Rebecca Stone will file at 8. Will she win? Ivy asked. She said judges don't like incomplete custody chains, especially when a medical welfare concern is documented. That's not a yes. Lawyers rarely speak in yes. He paused. But she sounded pleased, and with Rebecca, that's close. Ivy leaned back against the wall. Exhaustion finally came for her in full, not as sleepiness, but as a heaviness in her bones. Buster had settled beside her now, not touching, but near enough that his shoulder warmed the air by her knee. His muzzle had been loosened slightly under Dr. Keene's supervision, though not removed. The red warning tag from the auction was still clipped to his temporary paperwork folder on the counter. Ivy stared at it until the words blurred. High risk. Advanced handler required. She wondered what label someone would have given her if grief could be printed on cardstock. High risk. Handles pressure until collapse. Requires quiet rooms and no sudden fireworks. Sold as functional. Benjamin noticed her looking. A label is not a soul, he said. Ivy closed her eyes. People forget that. No, he said. People profit from forgetting. Morning came pale and damp. Ivy slept 2 hours in a vinyl chair and woke with a stiff neck, Buster standing over her like a silent guard. Denise brought coffee strong enough to qualify as a controlled substance. Dr. Keene removed Buster's muzzle briefly to check the strap sores, and Ivy held her breath as if the whole clinic were balanced on it. Buster did not bite. He did not growl. He only stood still, eyes fixed on Ivy, while Dr. Keene worked with gentle hands. Without the muzzle, His face looked older, more vulnerable, the scar near his jaw pulling slightly when he breathed. A patch of white fur marked his chin. One canine tooth was chipped. His mouth opened in a soft pant. And for one fleeting second Ivy saw the younger dog he had been, fierce and ridiculous, and always suspicious of anyone eating beef jerky without sharing. At 8:42 a.m., Rebecca Stone called. Ivy heard only Benjamin's side of the conversation. Yes, yes. Medical hold attached. Witness statements pending. Section 9 logged before removal. Good. He listened for a long moment. His face did not change, which was deeply unfair to everyone watching. Then he said, "Understood," and hung up. Ivy stood so quickly her knees protested. What? Benjamin looked at Buster first, then at her. Emergency petition granted. Temporary medical and rehabilitation custody approved, pending provenance review. Ivy stared at him. Meaning? Denise grinned from the doorway. Meaning pack your haunted horse dog, nurse. He's going to Savannah. Ivy put a hand over her mouth. She did not cry. Not fully. But something bright and painful moved through her chest, and she had to look away because hope, after a long absence, could feel almost violent when it returned. Buster watched her closely, tail still low, ears forward. He did not understand custody law. He did not know that a judge somewhere had just become the unlikely hinge on which his life turned. But he understood Ivy's breathing changed. He stepped closer and pressed his scarred head lightly against her thigh. By noon, the final temporary transfer packet arrived by email. By 1, Dr. Keene signed discharge instructions. By 2, Denise loaded Buster into the transport van again, this time with a padded mat, water, and Ivy seated beside him. Benjamin stood by the van door, holding a sealed envelope. Full service record, he said. What I could obtain quickly. Some pages are missing. Some are redacted. Some have been altered badly enough that even a tired colonel can smell the ink. Ivy took the envelope carefully. What am I supposed to do with this? Keep it safe. Read it when you're ready. Send copies to Rebecca. Do not send anything to Sentinel. Do not speak to Victor Hale if he contacts you. He paused. And fix the deadbolt. Ivy tried to smile. Denise already threatened me with a horror movie. Good. Listen to Denise. Then his expression changed. The humor, thin as it was, disappeared. The old command weight returned. Ivy, Victor Hale will not let this go. She looked past him toward the road, where traffic moved under a washed gray sky. Because of Buster? Because of what Buster represents. Benjamin's eyes were grave. A dog like him does not end up in an auction by accident. Not with missing records. Not with a buyer already positioned. Not with Sentinel willing to fight this hard over one old Malinois. He lowered his voice. There is something buried in that custody chain. Maybe negligence. Maybe fraud. Maybe worse. And men like Victor do not fear losing property. They fear losing control of the story. Ivy's fingers tightened around the envelope. Inside the van, Buster shifted, leaning his weight against her hip. She felt the warmth of him through her scrubs, solid and alive. Only yesterday, he had been a photograph on a message board and a wound she thought she had imagined. Now he was beside her, breathing, scarred, unwanted by the system that owed him better and wanted fiercely by the one person least able to afford the fight. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Benjamin's face softened, but his answer did not. Nobody does it first. That's comforting. It wasn't meant to be. Then, almost gently, he added, do the next right thing. Then the next. That's how people survive wars, hospitals, grief, and lawyers. Denise called from the driver's seat. We rolling or writing poetry out there? Benjamin stepped back. Take care of him. Ivy looked at Buster. I will. No, Benjamin said. Take care of each other. The van door closed. Charleston slipped away behind rain-streaked glass, its warehouses and cranes fading into the distance like a kingdom of iron losing its grip. Ivy sat on the padded floor beside Buster as Denise drove south toward Savannah. For the first 20 minutes, Buster remained upright, braced against every turn, eyes fixed on the back doors. Then, slowly, inch by inch, he lowered himself until his body rested against Ivy's leg. His head stayed up. His eyes stayed open. But he was closer. That was enough. Outside, the highway unrolled beneath a low silver sky. Ivy opened the envelope only once, just enough to see the top page. Buster's service photograph stared back at her. Younger, darker, ears sharp, eyes fierce, standing beside Caleb Ross under a sun-blasted wall half a world away. Ivy touched the edge of the photo with one finger, then closed the folder. Not yet. Some doors had to be opened carefully. For hours later, just before dusk, the van stopped outside Ivy's apartment in Savannah. The old brick building smelled faintly of rain, sugar, and warm bread from the bakery below. Spanish moss hung from the live oak across the street like gray ribbons. Mrs. Elaine Whitcomb appeared on the front steps before Ivy could even reach for her phone. The landlord was exactly as Ivy remembered. Small, thin, silver-curled, wearing a lavender cardigan, pearl earrings, and the expression of a woman who had survived 40 years of teaching 7th graders and therefore feared neither animals nor men. She looked at Buster, then at Ivy, then back at Buster. "Well," Mrs. Whitcomb said, "that is not a cat." Ivy gave a tired laugh. "No, ma'am." "Is he polite?" Buster stood beside Ivy, scarred, exhausted, watchful, and enormous. Ivy looked down at him. "He's trying." Mrs. Whitcomb considered this with solemn respect. "Aren't we all, baby?" Then she opened the door wider. "Bring him in. I made chicken." For the first time in 2 days, Ivy felt something in her heart unclench. Not safety. Not yet. But the fragile beginning of shelter. She led Buster up the narrow stairs, one step at a time. He paused at every landing, checked every shadow, listened to every old pipe in the walls. Ivy did not rush him. When they reached her apartment, the deadbolt stuck, because of course it did. She looked at Buster. Buster looked at her. "Don't judge me," she said. He blinked once, which felt very much like judgment. Inside, the apartment was small but warm. A couch with a faded blue blanket. A kitchen table with one uneven leg. A bookshelf crowded with nursing texts, old paperbacks, and a framed photo Ivy usually kept turned slightly away. Buster entered like a soldier clearing a room. He checked the windows, the hallway, the kitchen, the bathroom, then returned to the living room and stood in the center, uncertain what came next when no one shouted, no leash pulled, and no door closed him into darkness. Ivy placed a bowl of water near the wall and set the chicken Mrs. Whitcomb had sent on the counter to cool. Buster walked to the window, facing the live oak. He stood there for a long moment, watching moss move in the evening wind. Then he lowered himself onto the floor between the window and the couch. Not relaxed, not healed, but present. Ivy sat on the couch above him, the sealed envelope resting on her lap, Benjamin's warning still moving through her mind like distant thunder. Victor Hale will not let this go. At that moment, she did not yet understand how true those words were. She did not know about the complaints that would soon arrive at the hospital, the anonymous calls, the legal threats, or the shadowed figures already searching for weak points in her quiet little life. She only knew that Buster had made it through the door. He had water. He had food cooling on the counter. He had a place by the window. And for one evening, before the cost came due, that had to be enough. For the first 12 days, Ivy Morgan almost allowed herself to believe that shelter could be enough. Savannah received Buster like an old city receives rain. Cautiously at first, then with the kind of quiet patience that made broken things feel less ashamed of being broken. Ivy's apartment above the bakery was small, but it had corners Buster could study, windows he could guard, and floors old enough to creak before strangers arrived. Every morning before sunrise, the bakery below began breathing warm sugar into the stairwell, and Mrs. Elaine Whitcomb would leave something wrapped in foil outside Ivy's door. Biscuits, chicken, once a slice of peach pie with a note that said, "For the handsome gentleman with tragic eyes." Ivy read it aloud to Buster. He stared at her with solemn suspicion, as if pie might be a trap devised by enemy forces. "You're very dramatic," Ivy told him. Buster blinked once, which she had come to understand as disagreement. He was not easy. Ivy had not expected easy. The first night, Buster did not sleep. He lay between the couch and the front door, head raised, eyes open, ears shifting at every sound. Pipes ticking in the walls, footsteps on the sidewalk below, the soft sigh of Spanish moss brushing the window glass. At 2:17 a.m., a motorcycle backfired 2 streets over, and Buster was on his feet before Ivy had fully woken. He did not bark. That would have been easier. Instead, he moved silently through the apartment, checking the door, the kitchen, the bedroom window, the bathroom, then returning to Ivy's side as if confirming she had not been taken by the noise. Ivy sat on the edge of the bed, heart hammering, old memories rushing through her blood. "It's okay," she whispered. "Just Savannah being rude." He did not look convinced. Neither was she. By the fourth day, Ivy had learned the pattern. Buster slept in pieces. 20 minutes. 40 if the building was quiet. He drank water only after she stepped away from the bowl. He ate slowly, watching the door between bites. He hated elevators, men in baseball caps, the clatter of rolling trash bins, and delivery trucks that idled too long outside the bakery. He liked the live oak across the street, Mrs. Whitcomb's chicken, and lying where he could see both Ivy and the apartment entrance. He accepted Dr. Keene's prescribed ointment on the strap sores beneath his muzzle line, but only from Ivy's hand. When she touched the scar near his ear, he went very still, not resisting, not relaxing, simply enduring. Ivy knew that stillness. She had worn it herself in hospital elevators when someone asked, "Did you see bad things over there?" As if war were a movie, she could review politely between floors. Ivy was scheduled to return to work at Coastal Memorial Medical Center 2 weeks after bringing Buster home. The commute from Savannah to Charleston was long, but she had done it before during contract shifts. She arranged 12-hour blocks in clusters, sleeping at a staff room when necessary, coming home when she could. This time, leaving Buster felt like walking away from a patient still bleeding. Benjamin Carter helped her find a retired K-9 trainer outside Savannah named Nora Bell, who agreed to check on Buster during long shifts. Nora was 61, tall and angular, with short iron-gray hair, sun-browned skin, and hands that moved slowly because animals trusted slow hands. She had trained search dogs for disaster sites until a collapsed parking garage in Atlanta took 2 dogs and left her with a limp she never mentioned unless weather forced her to. Nora did not gush when she met Buster. She stood in Ivy's doorway, let him smell the air between them, and said, "That one's carrying a whole battlefield in his ribs." Ivy liked her immediately. The first sign of Victor Hale's revenge came as a phone call, not a threat. Ivy was 3 hours into her first shift back at Coastal Memorial when her supervisor, Margaret Sloan, asked to see her. Margaret was the emergency department nurse manager, a compact woman in her late 40s with warm brown skin, close-cropped black curls, and gold reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had the calm authority of someone who had raised 3 sons, survived 2 hospital mergers, and once told a furious surgeon, "You can shout after you wash your hands." Margaret was not easily frightened, which made the tightness around her mouth troubling. Her office smelled of printer toner and peppermint tea. Ivy sat across from her, still wearing trauma gloves tucked into one pocket. "I received a call from compliance this morning," Margaret said. Ivy felt something inside her go quiet. "About what?" "An anonymous concern regarding your professional judgment." The words were clean and bloodless, the way institutions preferred their knives. Margaret slid a printed notice across the desk. Ivy read it once, then again. The complaint alleged that Ivy had displayed erratic behavior at a public commercial event in Charleston, interfered with a legally purchased animal, demonstrated possible emotional instability connected to prior military trauma, and posed potential risk in high-pressure clinical environments. Ivy stared at the phrase prior military trauma until it seemed to detach from the page and float in front of her like smoke. Margaret watched her carefully. "I need you to tell me what happened." So Ivy did. Not everything. Not the ache of seeing Buster behind wire. Not the way he pressed his muzzle into her palm as if 6 years had been a locked room, and she had finally found the key. She gave Margaret the facts. The auction, the disputed custody chain, Dr. Keene's welfare hold, Benjamin Carter's legal filing, the emergency petition, the temporary custodianship. Margaret listened without interrupting. Her face did not soften, but her eyes did. When Ivy finished, Margaret leaned back. "Do you have documentation?" "Yes." "Good. Send it to me and hospital legal before the end of shift." Ivy swallowed. "Do you believe the complaint?" Margaret removed her glasses and set them on the desk. "Ivy, last winter you ran compressions on a drowning victim for 27 minutes, then apologized because you got blood on someone's shoes. I have concerns about your self-care, your caffeine intake, and your ability to admit when you need help. I do not have concerns about your judgment in a crisis." Ivy looked down quickly. Margaret's voice grew drier. "Also, Anyone who uses the phrase possible emotional instability anonymously is usually either a coward, a lawyer, or both. A small laugh escaped Ivy before she could stop it. Margaret almost smiled. Almost. But the complaint did not vanish. It became a file. Files were patient predators. They sat still until someone needed them. Over the next week, 3 more reports arrived. One claimed Ivy had violated public safety protocols by approaching a dangerous dog. Another suggested she had concealed a high-risk animal in a residential building. A third went to the South Carolina Board of Nursing, questioning whether a nurse with a former combat background and unresolved attachment to a military animal should continue practicing emergency medicine without psychological review. Every accusation was written in careful language, polished and poisonous, impossible to dismiss quickly because it had been designed not to prove guilt, but to generate process. Process exhausted people. Ivy knew that by the 10th day, she answered forms between shifts. She scanned Buster's temporary custody order at midnight. She forwarded Dr. Keene's assessment to hospital legal. She called Rebecca Stone twice from the parking garage, once while eating crackers from a vending machine because dinner had become theoretical. Rebecca was exactly as Benjamin had promised, sharp, fast, and entirely unimpressed by powerful men. When Ivy finally met her by video call, Rebecca appeared on screen from a Savannah office lined with legal books and dog-eared case files. She was 45, with dark red hair cut just below her jaw, pale freckled skin, and green eyes that made excuses feel unwelcome. She wore a charcoal blazer over a blue blouse and spoke with the clipped precision of someone who had learned early that being underestimated could be turned into a weapon. "This is volume harassment," Rebecca said after reviewing the complaints. "He is trying to make your life administratively expensive. Can he hurt my license?" Ivy asked. "Not with what he has." Rebecca paused. "But he can make you tired enough to make a mistake. Do not help him." That became Ivy's new rule. Do not help him. Do not answer unknown calls. Do not respond to Sentinel. Do not post online. Do not explain herself to people who had already chosen suspicion because suspicion felt more exciting than truth. She went to work. She came home. She cared for Buster. She documented everything. She slept badly. Buster noticed before anyone else did. By the 3rd week, he had begun following Ivy from room to room. At first, she thought it was attachment, fear of abandonment, the shadow of too many transfers. But then she realized he followed her most closely on days she forgot to eat. He would stand between her and the door, blocking her path with 90 pounds of scarred conviction, until she looked down and said, "What?" Then he would glance toward the kitchen. The first time he did it, she laughed. The second time, she checked the clock and realized she had gone 9 hours on coffee and half a banana. "You're bossy," she told him. Buster looked at the refrigerator. "Fine." She made eggs. He watched like a field commander supervising poor troops. There were small victories. He began sleeping for longer stretches if the radio played low jazz. He allowed Nora Bell to enter the apartment without placing himself between her and Ivy every second, though he still watched her with the stern disapproval of an old bishop. He learned that Mrs. Wickham's knock meant food, not danger. He even accepted a blue rubber ball Nora brought, though he did not play with it so much as capture it and place it beneath the coffee table like evidence. Ivy found herself smiling more than she expected. Not big smiles, not healed smiles, but small sparks of warmth in the ashes. Then the text came. It was 11:38 p.m. on a Thursday. Ivy had returned from Charleston 2 hours earlier, showered, fed Buster, and fallen asleep on the couch with the sealed service folder open across her lap. She woke when her phone buzzed against the floorboards. Buster lifted his head at the same instant. Ivy blinked at the screen. Unknown number. Stop now. 2 words. No punctuation. No name. No explanation. For several seconds, she simply stared. The apartment felt suddenly smaller. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the window. The bakery below was dark. The live oak shifted in the wind, its moss trailing like ghost hair. Buster rose without sound and walked to the front door. He did not bark. He stood there, head angled, listening to the hallway. Ivy's first impulse was anger. Clean, bright, almost welcome. Then came fear, colder and more practical. They had her number. Of course they did. Victor Hale could find a phone number. But the timing, the simplicity, the lack of legal costume around the message, It felt different from the complaints. Less polished, more personal. She screenshotted it and sent it to Rebecca Stone. Rebecca replied 4 minutes later, "Do not respond." Send to Benjamin. "I'm logging it. Lock your door and windows." Ivy looked at the deadbolt, newly repaired after Denise and Benjamin had bullied her into hiring a locksmith. "Already locked," she whispered. Buster remained at the door for 20 minutes. The next morning, Benjamin called. His voice was calm, which Ivy had learned did not mean things were fine. It meant he had placed worry where it could not interfere with function. "Any more messages?" he asked. "No." "Anyone outside?" "No." "Good. This may be intimidation, not action. That is supposed to comfort me?" "No." At least he was honest. The following days became a study in nerves. Ivy began noticing cars parked too long near the bakery. Men whose faces she would have ignored a month ago became possible threats. A black pickup idling near the corner made her heart kick hard enough that she stood behind the curtain for 5 minutes before realizing the driver was a teenager eating fries. She hated that. She hated what fear did to the ordinary world. It turned delivery vans into omens, footsteps into warnings, neighbors into silhouettes. Buster, who had lived inside that kind of vigilance for years, seemed almost unsurprised. This was the world as he knew it. Every door a question, every sound a potential breach. At work, the process tightened. Hospital compliance scheduled an interview. Margaret attended with Ivy as witness support, sitting beside her with arms folded and expression firm enough to make the compliance officer nervous. The officer, Thomas Vale, was a thin man in his mid-30s with sandy hair, narrow shoulders, and a habit of tapping his pen before asking questions. He was not cruel, only procedural in the way some people became when they were afraid of making decisions without a policy attached. He asked Ivy whether she believed her attachment to Buster could affect her clinical judgment. Ivy answered, no. He asked whether she had ever experienced panic episodes during emergency care. She answered, no. He asked whether her military history had created unresolved emotional triggers. Margaret interrupted. Mr. Vale, if the hospital begins asking every veteran employee to defend their trauma history because an anonymous complaint used it as a weapon, we are going to need a much larger conference room and a much better attorney. Thomas Vale turned pink. Ivy loved Margaret a little in that moment. Still, the questions left bruises no one could see. That night, Ivy came home hollowed out. She sat on the kitchen floor instead of making dinner. Buster approached slowly, sniffed her sleeve, then lowered himself beside her with a groan that made him sound like an old man judging the furniture. Ivy laughed once, then cried before she could stop herself. Not loudly, just tears sliding down her face while she pressed her hand into Buster's shoulder. He did not understand bureaucracy, but he understood collapse. He leaned into her until her breathing steadied. The man came 3 nights later. It was after midnight. Savannah had gone quiet in the damp summer way, streets shining under lamplight, insects singing from hidden gardens, the bakery ovens still cold below. Ivy was in bed, but not asleep. Buster lay on the floor between her bedroom and the front door. The radio murmured low in the living room. Then Buster's head snapped up. Ivy froze. There was no bark, no growl, only the shift of his body rising, powerful and silent. His ears pointed toward the apartment door. Ivy listened. At first, nothing. Then a soft sound in the hallway. A footstep. The building was old. It announced visitors with creaks and complaints. But this was careful. Too careful. Someone trying not to let the floor speak. Ivy reached for her phone. Buster moved to the living room, placing himself between her and the front door. His body lowered slightly, not crouching, not attacking, but ready. Ivy followed to the hallway entrance, barefoot, pulse hammering. The doorknob turned. Slowly. Not a knock. Not a mistake. Not Mrs. Whitcomb with pie. The knob shifted once, stopped, then turned again with more pressure. The deadbolt held. Buster changed. It was subtle and terrifying. The old stiffness left him. The fear vanished beneath training so deep it might as well have been carved into bone. He became silent purpose. His head lowered. His shoulders rose. His amber eyes fixed on the door. Ivy felt, with cold certainty, that if the door opened, Buster would meet whatever came through it with the full weight of every battlefield he had survived. She dialed 911 with shaking fingers, but kept her voice low. Someone is trying to get into my apartment. The dispatcher was a woman with a calm Georgia drawl who asked for Ivy's address, whether she was alone, whether the door was locked, whether the person was still there. Ivy answered while staring at the knob. It moved once more, then stopped. Footsteps retreated down the hall. Slow, controlled, not running. Buster remained frozen until the stairwell door opened below and closed. Only then did he release a growl, so low Ivy felt it in her feet. The police arrived 8 minutes later. The responding officer was Daniel Ruiz, a broad-shouldered Savannah patrolman in his early 40s with a trimmed black beard, tired brown eyes, and the steady courtesy of someone who had seen people frightened in their own homes and knew not to make them feel foolish for it. His partner, Officer Emily Park, was younger, maybe 27, Korean-American, slim, sharp-eyed, with her dark hair pulled into a tight bun and a voice gentle enough to calm Mrs. Whitcomb, who had appeared in the hallway wearing a robe, slippers, and the expression of a woman prepared to fight crime with a rolling pin. Officer Ruiz inspected the door. No damage. No tool marks. Could have been checking if it was unlocked, he said. Ivy nodded. Her mouth was dry. Officer Park took her statement and glanced at Buster, who stood behind Ivy like a shadow with teeth. He alerted you? Yes. Officer Park's eyes softened. Good dog. Buster did not acknowledge the compliment, but Mrs. Whitcomb said, he is a very good dog, with such fierce pride that Ivy nearly broke again. The building's small lobby camera caught a figure entering at 12:11 and leaving at 12:19. Male, medium height, dark hoodie, baseball cap low over his face. Not enough for identification. Enough to prove Ivy had not imagined it. Rebecca Stone arrived the next morning before Ivy had finished her coffee. The lawyer wore black slacks, flat shoes, and the expression of a woman who considered intimidation both illegal and personally insulting. She reviewed the police report at Ivy's kitchen table while Buster watched from the window. This changes things, Rebecca said. This is no longer just administrative pressure. Benjamin arrived an hour later, driving down from Charleston in a mud-splattered truck that looked older than some interns. He stepped into the apartment, scanned the door, the windows, the stairwell sightlines, and Buster's position before he even said hello. Mrs. Whitcomb brought coffee without being asked. Colonel, she said, handing him a mug. If bad men are coming around my building, I expect names. Benjamin accepted the coffee. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Whitcomb nodded. Good. I bake, but I also vote. Rebecca explained the complaints, the text, and the attempted entry as part of one escalating pattern. Victor may not have ordered the door attempt directly, she said. Men like him often keep distance from ugly things. But someone connected to Sentinel wants Ivy scared enough to drop the custody dispute. Benjamin stood by the window, looking down at the street. Or scared enough to make a mistake. Ivy folded her arms. Everyone keeps saying that. Rebecca looked at her. Because it's true. Ivy wanted to say she was not scared. But lying in her own kitchen seemed unnecessary. I am scared, she said. I'm also angry. Benjamin nodded. Good. Fear keeps you careful. Anger keeps you standing. Just don't let either one drive. Buster pressed his shoulder against Ivy's leg. She looked down at him. The dog had been called dangerous, unstable, a liability, a problem. Yet when danger came to her door, he had not lost control. He had not panicked. He had done exactly what war had taught him to do, stand between harm and the person he had chosen. That was when Ivy understood. The fight was not about whether Buster could live quietly in her apartment. It was not even about whether Victor Hale had lost an expensive dog. The complaints, the text, the man at the door, these were not random acts of wounded pride. They were pressure points. Someone was testing how much fear Ivy could carry before she set Buster down and walked away. She looked at Benjamin. What are they hiding? The old colonel's face grew grim. I don't know yet, he said. But after last night, I'm certain of one thing. What? He looked at Buster, then at the repaired deadbolt, then back at Ivy. Whatever it is, they think it's worth threatening you over. Ivy stood in her small Savannah kitchen, with rain tapping the window, a retired war dog at her side, a lawyer at her table, a colonel by her door, and an old landlord downstairs ready to wage holy war with baked goods. The absurdity of it nearly made her laugh. The danger nearly made her sick. Buster lifted his scarred head and looked toward the hallway again, still listening, still guarding, still carrying the old battlefield inside him. Ivy rested her hand on his back. All right. she whispered, though she was not sure whether she was speaking to Buster, to Benjamin, to God, or to the fear moving through her own chest. Then we don't walk away. The rain finally stopped during the first week of October. Savannah emerged from 3 days of gray skies smelling like wet brick, magnolia leaves, and river wind. Sunlight returned in thin golden sheets across the old streets, touching church steeples, iron balconies, and the moss-covered oaks that lined Ivy Morgan's neighborhood. To most people, it felt like relief. To Ivy, it felt like the calm that sometimes arrived before a trauma patient crashed. 3 weeks had passed since the man tried to enter her apartment. 3 weeks since the anonymous text message. 3 weeks since Victor Hale's invisible pressure campaign had stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like strategy. Buster sensed it too. The old Belgian Malinois had changed since arriving in Savannah. Not healed. Healing implied the wound was finished. Buster's wounds were still alive. But he was adapting. The first morning Ivy woke to find him sleeping deeply enough to dream, she nearly cried. His paws twitched against the floorboards. A low sound escaped his throat. Not fear. Not warning. Something softer. Maybe memory. Maybe a place before the war. Maybe Caleb Ross. The moment lasted less than a minute. Then a truck shifted gears outside and Buster exploded awake, instantly alert. The dream vanished. The soldier returned. Ivy understood. Some scars never disappeared. You simply learned how to carry them. The same was becoming true for her. At Coastal Memorial Medical Center, the anonymous complaints continued arriving, but something had changed. The complaints were no longer working. People who actually worked beside Ivy every day knew her too well. They had watched her save lives, watched her stay late, watched her comfort families after impossible losses, watched her quietly do the work while louder people took credit. The rumors kept arriving. The trust remained, which made Victor Hale's strategy increasingly expensive and dangerous, because when intimidation fails, powerful people often escalate. That realization sat heavily inside Rebecca Stone's office one Tuesday afternoon. Rebecca's law office occupied the second floor of an aging red brick building near Savannah's historic district. The room was packed with legal files, military records, court documents, photographs, whiteboards covered in notes, coffee cups, and one increasingly complicated investigation. Rebecca sat behind her desk reviewing financial records. She wore a charcoal suit jacket over a navy blouse. Her red hair was tied loosely behind her head. Dark circles lingered beneath her green eyes. The look suited her. Rebecca Stone did some of her best work when she was angry, and she was becoming very angry. "Something isn't right," she said. Benjamin Carter sat across from her. The retired colonel looked older than he had during the auction. Weeks of investigation had carved fresh lines into his face. His white beard needed trimming. His eyes carried the look of a man slowly assembling a puzzle he wished did not exist. "What did you find?" he asked. Rebecca turned her monitor toward him. Sentinel Defense Group. Federal security contracts. State contracts. Private contracts. Millions of dollars. Pages and pages of them. Benjamin frowned. "That's not unusual." "No." Rebecca tapped several highlighted entries. "This is..." Several payments had moved through consulting companies that technically existed, but barely. Shell offices. Empty buildings. Mail forwarding services. Consultants with no employees. Millions flowing through organizations that appeared to do almost nothing. Benjamin leaned closer. Money laundering? Maybe. Rebecca wasn't ready to guess. Good attorneys learned the difference between suspicion and proof. "I need evidence." Benjamin nodded. Neither noticed the email arriving at that exact moment. The subject line contained only 3 words. "You are right." The sender field was blank. Rebecca opened it, then stopped moving. Benjamin immediately noticed. "What?" Rebecca stared at the screen. The message contained one sentence. "Victor Hale isn't protecting contracts. He's protecting secrets." Below the message was a file attachment. Rebecca did not open it immediately. Years of legal work had taught her caution. Instead, she forwarded it to a secure review system. 3 minutes later, the file appeared. An internal Sentinel Defense spreadsheet. Employee access logs. Financial tracking records. Approval chains. Names. Dates. Payment transfers. Benjamin's expression darkened. Where did this come from? Rebecca looked back at the email. Nothing. No signature. No explanation. Only the file. And one final line. "Please help me." The sender had made a mistake. A tiny mistake, small enough most people would miss it. But not Rebecca. The file metadata still contained a username, Emily Dawson. The name meant nothing. Yet, 3 days later it meant everything. The first phone call arrived at 8:17 p.m. Rebecca answered. A woman's voice whispered, "Are you alone?" Rebecca immediately stood. The tone wasn't paranoia. It was fear. Real fear. Who is this? Silence. Then, Emily. Rebecca exchanged a glance with Benjamin. The colonel slowly closed the office door. The woman continued. My name is Emily Dawson. She sounded young. Late 20s maybe. Educated. Controlled. Trying desperately not to panic. I work for Sentinel. Neither Rebecca nor Benjamin interrupted. People tell the truth more easily when nobody rushes them. Emily inhaled slowly. I think they're watching me. Benjamin finally spoke. Who? Silence. Then, everyone. The answer wasn't dramatic. It was exhausted. Rebecca felt something cold move through her chest. People only reached that point after being afraid for a very long time. They arranged a meeting. Not at the office. Not at Emily's home. Not anywhere predictable. Instead, they chose a crowded farmer's market outside Savannah. Saturday morning. Thousands of people. Noise. Witnesses. Safety. Hopefully. When Saturday arrived, Ivy came too. Rebecca insisted. If Emily truly possessed information related to Buster's custody records, Ivy needed to hear it. The farmer's market sprawled across several blocks. Families wandered between food stalls. Children chased balloons. Musicians played near the fountain. The smell of coffee mixed with barbecue and fresh bread. Normal life. Exactly the kind of place fear hated. Benjamin spotted Emily first. She arrived alone. 29 years old. Medium height. Slender build. Dark brown hair pulled into a low ponytail. Pale skin. Brown eyes surrounded by exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of hard work. The exhaustion of carrying a secret too long. She wore jeans. Running shoes. A gray sweatshirt despite the warm weather. No jewelry. No makeup. Nothing memorable. Someone had intentionally learned how to disappear. Emily sat on a bench near the fountain. Her hands trembled. Not dramatically. Just enough. Benjamin approached first. Then Rebecca. Then Ivy. Emily looked up and immediately froze. Not because of them. Because of Buster. The dog sat beside Ivy. Alert. Silent. Watching. Emily's face lost color. Oh God. Ivy frowned. What? Emily stared at Buster. Then tears appeared. Instantly. Unexpectedly. Violently. People walking nearby never noticed. But Ivy did. Benjamin did. Rebecca definitely did. Emily covered her mouth. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Finally, she whispered. They told us he died. The world seemed to stop. What? Benjamin asked. Emily looked directly at Buster. We were told Buster died 2 years ago. Nobody spoke. The fountain continued running. Children laughed nearby. The market kept moving. But at that table, everything changed. Emily slowly opened her backpack. Inside were documents. Folders. Flash drives. Printed emails. Payment records. Copies. Hundreds of pages. She placed them on the table. They've been lying for years. Rebecca's pulse accelerated. Start from the beginning. Emily looked around. Still frightened. Still checking faces. Still expecting someone to appear. Then she began. Emily Dawson worked in Sentinel's internal compliance division. Her job wasn't exciting. She reviewed documentation, verified records, approved filing procedures, tracked employee certifications. Boring work. Safe work. Until she noticed inconsistencies. Small things. Dates changing. Missing signatures. Employee access logs disappearing. Military dog records altered after approval. At first she assumed mistakes. Then she discovered patterns. Patterns became evidence. Evidence became fear. And eventually fear became certainty. Someone inside Sentinel was manipulating records. Large numbers of records. Including Buster's. Emily removed a photograph from the folder. Benjamin immediately recognized it. So did Ivy. Buster. 2 years earlier. Standing inside a rehabilitation facility. Healthy. Alive. Very much alive. Yet according to several internal reports, he was dead. Emily swallowed. Someone officially reported his death. Ivy felt sick. Why? Emily shook her head. I don't know. But she knew something else. Something worse. Buster wasn't the only one. Several military working dogs had vanished from official tracking systems. Some appeared later under different identifiers. Others disappeared completely. Paperwork altered. Files erased. Ownership transferred. Money moved. Benjamin's jaw tightened. This was becoming far bigger than one dog. Far bigger than Victor Hale. Rebecca opened another folder. Payment records. Contract awards. Government agencies. Private subcontractors. Millions. Then tens of millions. Emily pointed towards several highlighted names. These people received payments after questioning Sentinel's contracts. Benjamin read the numbers. His expression darkened. You think they were bought? Emily shook her head. No. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I think they were threatened. Nobody spoke, because everyone suddenly remembered Ivy's complaints. The anonymous text. The man at the apartment door. The pattern. The exact same pattern. Emily lowered her eyes. They do this. Do what? Ivy asked. They don't destroy people. Emily looked up. Fear returned. Pure fear. They exhaust them. The words hit Ivy harder than anything else. Because they were true. That was exactly what had happened. Paperwork. Complaints. Pressure. Questions. Doubt. Fear. Never enough to prove wrongdoing. Always enough to drain strength. Emily reached into her backpack one final time. She removed a flash drive. Small. Black. Ordinary. Potentially explosive. Everything is on here. Rebecca accepted it carefully. What exactly is everything? Emily looked at each of them. Then at Buster. Then back again. Enough to start an investigation. Silence followed. Long silence. Because everyone understood what that meant. Not a lawsuit. Not a complaint. Not a custody dispute. An investigation. Official. Government. Dangerous. The kind Victor Hale could not simply bully away. For the first time in weeks, hope appeared. Small. Fragile. But real. And somewhere inside a network of contracts, shell companies, altered records, missing dogs, secret payments, and frightened employees. The truth had finally found a witness. Emily Dawson did not stay long after handing over the flash drive. People who had spent months living inside fear rarely lingered once they finally told the truth. The meeting ended quietly. No dramatic promises. No handshakes. No speeches. Emily simply stood from the bench, adjusted the strap of her backpack, and looked at Buster one last time. The old Belgian Malinois remained seated beside Ivy, watching her with calm amber eyes. For several seconds neither moved. Then Emily whispered something so softly only Ivy heard it. I'm sorry. The apology wasn't for her. It wasn't even for Buster. It was for every day she had known something was wrong and had remained silent because silence felt safer than truth. Buster tilted his head slightly. Emily's eyes filled with tears again. Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd. Benjamin watched her leave. She's terrified. Rebecca nodded. Good. Ivy frowned. Rebecca continued. People who aren't afraid usually don't understand what they're risking. The lawyer slipped the flash drive into her briefcase. This one understands perfectly. That worried Ivy more than anything Emily had revealed. Because people only became that frightened when they knew exactly what powerful people were capable of doing. 3 hours later, they discovered Emily had been right. The flash drive contained far more than anyone expected. Rebecca's office became a war room. Boxes of documents covered every available surface. Coffee appeared. Then more coffee. Then stronger coffee. Benjamin claimed the strongest blend smelled like jet fuel. Rebecca replied that was because it practically was. Nobody laughed very hard. The files consumed them. Thousands of pages. Financial records. Contract correspondence. Payment approvals. Internal disciplinary reports. Deleted email recoveries. Employee access logs. And buried among them. Patterns. The same pattern repeated again and again. Individuals who questioned Sentinel defense contracts suddenly faced investigations. Audits. Anonymous complaints. Professional reviews. Tax inquiries. Licensing complaints. Ethics allegations. Nothing serious enough to destroy them. Only enough to exhaust them. Rebecca stared at one spreadsheet. Her expression darkened. Jesus. Benjamin looked up. What? She turned the monitor toward him. 27 names. 27 separate individuals. Everyone connected to public security contracts. Everyone had raised concerns. Everyone later experienced some form of pressure campaign. The similarities were impossible to ignore. One county commissioner lost his re-election campaign after anonymous allegations surfaced. A procurement officer suddenly faced licensing complaints. A consultant's business was audited. A military contractor found himself under investigation. None of the accusations were ultimately proven. That wasn't the point. The investigations themselves were the punishment. Benjamin slowly sat back. They built a system. Rebecca nodded. Not a conspiracy. Not random corruption. A system. Refined. Repeated. Effective. And terrifying. Ivy looked at the list. Then at her own complaints. Then back again. Her name wasn't there. Not yet. But the pattern was unmistakable. The same thing had happened to her. The exact same thing. Victor Hale hadn't invented a strategy specifically for Ivy Morgan. He had simply used one he had already used many times before. For years, Buster lay beneath Rebecca's desk. The old dog had spent most of the afternoon asleep. Actually asleep. A rare event. His breathing remained slow and steady. Occasionally his paws twitched. The office had become one of the few places where he seemed comfortable. Perhaps because everyone inside had stopped trying to control him. Perhaps because the room smelled like people fighting for something. Dogs often understood purpose better than humans did. At 6:30 that evening, Rebecca found something worse. Much worse. A folder labeled Operational Asset Recovery. The name sounded harmless. Corporate. Boring. Rebecca opened it. Her face lost color. Benjamin immediately noticed. What is it? She didn't answer. Instead, she scrolled. Then scrolled again. Then again. Ivy stepped closer. The document outlined procedures for recovering misallocated operational resources. At first glance, it looked like standard corporate language. Then Rebecca reached page 14. And everything changed. The policy specifically discussed retired military working dogs, transportation procedures, recovery procedures, ownership disputes, private investigations, behavioral leverage assessments. Benjamin's jaw tightened. Behavioral leverage? Rebecca continued reading. The phrase appeared repeatedly. Behavioral leverage referred to emotional attachments. Handlers, family members, caretakers, weak points, pressure points, people. The room went silent. Ivy felt sick. Buster wasn't merely valuable because he was a military dog. Buster mattered because someone knew people cared about him. And caring could be weaponized. Rebecca slowly closed the document. I think we've crossed into criminal territory. Nobody disagreed. The following morning, Rebecca contacted the Georgia Attorney General's office. Not a public submission. Not an official complaint. A preliminary confidential review. The type lawyers initiated when evidence became too dangerous to ignore. The response arrived faster than expected. By noon, they received a request for a meeting. That surprised everyone, especially Rebecca. Government agencies moved many ways. Fast was rarely one of them, which meant somebody reading the evidence understood exactly how serious it was. The meeting took place 2 days later. Not in Savannah. Not in Charleston. Atlanta. A secure conference room inside a state government building. The investigator waiting for them was named Marcus Holloway. 54 years old. 6'3", broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, silver beginning to creep into his closely cropped hair. His face carried deep lines around the eyes and mouth. Not from age, from disappointment. Marcus looked like a man who had spent 20 years discovering how creative corruption could become. He greeted everyone politely, then spent 3 hours asking questions. Careful questions, detailed questions, uncomfortable questions. By the end of the meeting, he looked exhausted, which was not reassuring. Finally, he leaned back. What you're describing is organized influence manipulation. Benjamin frowned. Meaning? Marcus folded his hands. Meaning somebody built a machine. The phrase sounded familiar, because it matched exactly what Rebecca had already concluded. Not isolated misconduct. Not random bad actors. A machine. A system. One designed to silence opposition without leaving obvious fingerprints. Marcus reviewed Emily's files. Then the financial records. Then the ownership records. Then Buster's missing custody chain. Finally, he sighed. Officially, I haven't seen enough. Everyone's heart sank. Then he continued. Unofficially, this is one of the worst things I've reviewed in years. Hope returned. Carefully. Slowly. Marcus stood. I can't promise outcomes. Rebecca nodded. I know. But I can promise attention. That mattered. More than people realized. Power survived in darkness. Attention brought light. And light changed everything. The investigation officially began 3 days later. Nobody announced it publicly. No headlines appeared. No television crews arrived. The most dangerous investigations rarely started with sirens. They started quietly. behind closed doors, with subpoenas, data requests, interviews, financial reviews, and people suddenly realizing their records were no longer private. Victor Hale learned about it within 48 hours. Nobody knew how, but powerful people always seemed to know. Benjamin received the first indication during a phone call from an old military contact, a retired procurement officer named Charles Finley. Charles was 70, thin, sharp-featured, bald, perpetually irritated, the type of man who treated friendship as a professional inconvenience. He called Benjamin at 6 in the morning. "You're making people nervous." Benjamin sipped coffee. "Good. I'm serious." "So am I." Charles lowered his voice. "I've heard Victor Hale is moving assets." Benjamin became still. That wasn't good. Companies moved assets before investigations for many reasons. Most of them bad. "How much?" "A lot." Benjamin thanked him and hung up. Then immediately called Rebecca. The race had begun. Meanwhile, life continued, which felt unfair. People still got sick. Cars still crashed. Children still fell off bicycles. Hospitals still filled with emergencies. And Ivy still worked. One Friday evening, Coastal Memorial received a trauma alert. Multi-vehicle collision. Interstate 95. Teenage victim. Critical condition. The emergency department exploded into motion. Stretchers moved. Monitors activated. Trauma teams assembled. Everything else vanished. Complaints. Threats. Investigations. Fear. All of it disappeared beneath purpose. The patient arrived 12 minutes later. 17 years old. Male. Massive blood loss. Chest trauma. Airway compromise. His name was Tyler Brooks. Tyler looked impossibly young. Freckles across his nose. Brown hair matted with blood. A football bracelet still wrapped around one wrist. One shoe missing. The kind of patient that made everyone remember somebody they loved. Ivy moved instantly. No hesitation. No uncertainty. The world narrowed. Airway. Breathing. Circulation. The fundamentals. Always the fundamentals. Chaos surrounded her. But inside the chaos, she found clarity. People often misunderstood courage. Courage wasn't fearlessness. Courage was function. The ability to continue moving despite fear. For 47 minutes, the trauma team fought. Doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, technicians, everyone. Tyler crashed twice. They brought him back twice. Finally, the bleeding stopped. The pulse stabilized. The monitors settled. And the room exhaled. Hours later, the surgeon emerged from the operating room. Tyler would survive. Barely, but survive. The news spread quickly. Hospitals always noticed extraordinary saves, especially when accomplished by someone currently under scrutiny. Margaret Sloan noticed too. She found Ivy sitting alone in the break room after midnight. Exhausted, silent, covered in sweat. Margaret handed her a bottle of water. "You know compliance closed your case today." Ivy looked up. "What?" "The complaints." Margaret sat beside her. "Every single one." For a moment, Ivy couldn't speak. Margaret smiled slightly. "Turns out anonymous accusations don't hold much weight when everyone who actually works with you says they're nonsense." Relief arrived slowly. Then all at once. Not because the investigation was over. Not because Victor Hale was defeated. But because one burden had finally lifted. Margaret studied her. "Whatever is happening outside this hospital." She nodded toward the trauma bay. "Remember who you are in there." Ivy looked through the glass. Nurses moved between rooms. Monitors beeped. Lives continued. Purpose remained. "I will." Margaret squeezed her shoulder once, then returned to work. Late that night, Ivy drove home. The road stretched dark beneath the headlights. Spanish moss swayed in the trees. The city slept. When she entered the apartment, Buster met her at the door. Not excited. Not dramatic. Just present. Reliable. Waiting. The old dog inspected her briefly. Satisfied himself she remained intact. Then returned to his spot near the window. Ivy smiled. The apartment felt different now. Not safer, but stronger. Outside, investigations were spreading. Evidence was growing. Witnesses were talking. Truth was moving. Slowly, but moving. Inside, Buster rested beneath the window. The same dog powerful people had tried to sell. The same dog whose existence had accidentally exposed something much larger than anyone imagined. And somewhere beyond Savannah, Victor Hale was beginning to realize that the story was no longer under his control. The truth was no longer hiding. It was coming. The first article appeared on a cold Thursday morning in November. It was published at 6:02 a.m. By 6:45, people were sharing it across veteran forums. By 8 o'clock, attorneys were forwarding it to colleagues. By noon, military working dog organizations across the country were posting links. And by sunset, Victor Hale's phone had become the most unpleasant object in his life. The article came from the Atlanta Journal. Not a blog, not social media, not an anonymous whistleblower website. A real newspaper. The kind powerful people feared because facts remained visible long after excuses disappeared. The headline was simple: the dog they tried to erase. Below it sat a photograph. Buster, standing beside Ivy Morgan outside her Savannah apartment. His scarred face turned toward the camera. Amber eyes steady. No muzzle. No chain. No auction tag. Just a retired military dog who looked exactly like what he had always been. A veteran. The article had been written by Sarah Whitaker, 42 years old, investigative reporter, tall, lean, sharp-featured, dark blonde hair usually pulled into a practical ponytail, gray-blue eyes that missed very little. Sarah carried herself with the controlled intensity of someone who had spent 2 decades learning that corruption survived by exhausting honest people before the truth could catch up. 10 years earlier, she had exposed a public contracting scandal in Alabama that cost her friendships, promotion opportunities, and eventually her marriage. The experience had changed her, not hardened her, refined her. She no longer chased headlines. She chased patterns. And when Rebecca Stone quietly approached her with documents, financial records, whistleblower statements, and Buster's altered custody history, Sarah immediately recognized a pattern. The story was never about a dog. The dog simply revealed where people should start looking. The article was devastating, not because it accused anyone directly, because it documented. Every claim contained records, dates, emails, transfer documents, public contracts, witness statements. Nothing sensationalized, nothing exaggerated. The facts alone were enough. Readers learned how a decorated military working dog had nearly disappeared into a suspicious custody chain. They learned how anonymous complaints targeted people who questioned Sentinel defense. They learned about missing records, questionable payments, shell companies, whistleblowers, and an ER nurse named Ivy Morgan who had unknowingly stepped into the middle of it all simply because she refused to abandon a retired war dog. Sarah's final paragraph hit hardest. Sometimes corruption reveals itself through missing money, sometimes through altered records, sometimes through frightened witnesses, and sometimes through a forgotten dog who survived long enough to expose the people who wanted him forgotten. By lunch, the article had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Veteran communities exploded. Facebook groups, military forums, retired handler associations, K-9 training organizations. Everyone seemed to know someone who knew someone connected to the story. Photos began appearing. Old deployment photographs, pictures of military working dogs, stories from former handlers, memories, tributes. People who had never met Buster suddenly recognized him. A retired Marine in Texas uploaded a photograph from Afghanistan. Buster appeared in the background. A former Army medic in Colorado posted another. A military contractor in Arizona shared a third. The old dog had traveled farther through people's lives than anyone realized. And people remembered. By the second day, the movement had a name. Justice for Buster. Nobody knew who started it. Nobody claimed ownership. It simply appeared, then spread. The phrase moved across social media. T-shirts, fundraisers, veteran organizations, military dog charities. The story was becoming impossible to contain. Meanwhile, inside Sentinel Defense Headquarters in Charleston, Victor Hale was discovering what it felt like to lose control. The headquarters occupied 3 floors of a modern glass office building overlooking the harbor. Victor's corner office sat at the very top. Floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive artwork, custom furniture, imported wood, everything designed to communicate power. For years it had worked. Now it felt increasingly fragile. Victor stood at the window holding a printed copy of Sarah Whitaker's article. He had already read it 4 times. The words hadn't improved. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." His chief legal counsel entered. Gregory Vance, 58 years old. Silver hair, perfect posture, expensive suit, a face permanently arranged into polite concern. Gregory had spent 3 decades protecting corporations from consequences. He was exceptionally good at it, which made his current expression deeply troubling. "We have a problem." Victor laughed once. A cold sound. Just one. Gregory closed the office door. The governor's procurement review board suspended 3 contract renewals this morning. Victor stopped smiling. Temporary. Maybe. Gregory hesitated. Federal inquiries are beginning. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to break furniture. Victor slowly sat down. For the first time in years, uncertainty entered the room. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. And uncertainty was dangerous. Especially for men who built careers around predicting outcomes. How much exposure? Victor asked. Gregory exhaled. Unknown. Unknown. Victor hated that word. Across the country, the article continued spreading. Television stations picked it up. National veteran organizations issued statements. Military working dog advocacy groups demanded reviews of retirement procedures. Members of Congress requested briefings. State officials began asking questions. And every question led back toward Sentinel, toward Victor, toward contracts, toward money, toward records someone had hoped would remain buried. Ivy discovered most of this accidentally. She was working a 12-hour shift when Margaret Sloan intercepted her near the trauma bay. Margaret carried a tablet. A smile threatened to appear. You should probably see this. Ivy accepted the tablet. The article filled the screen. Her stomach immediately tightened. Oh no. Margaret laughed. That surprised Ivy. Most people don't react that way when they're on the front page. I didn't ask for this. I know. Margaret's expression softened. That's why people believe it. Around them, several nurses were already reading copies. A respiratory therapist gave Ivy a thumbs up. Someone else shouted, "Hey, Buster." The entire department laughed. Ivy covered her face. Mortified. Margaret looked delighted. For the first time in months, the people around Ivy weren't discussing complaints, or investigations, or anonymous allegations. They were discussing the truth. That mattered, more than she realized. After work, Ivy drove back to Savannah under a sky streaked with orange and purple. The city felt different. People recognized her. Not many, just enough. A man pumping gas nodded and said, "Tell Buster we said thanks." A woman outside a grocery store smiled. "My husband served in Iraq." We read the article. An elderly veteran approached cautiously near the bakery. He wore a faded army cap and carried a wooden cane polished smooth from use. "My dog saved my life once," he said. Then he simply shook Ivy's hand and walked away. No speeches, no questions, just gratitude. The attention felt strange, uncomfortable, but genuine. When she reached home, Buster greeted her at the door. The old dog had gained weight. Not much, just enough. His coat looked healthier. His eyes seemed calmer. The constant tension still existed, but it no longer owned him. Ivy knelt beside him. "You've become famous." Buster sneezed, which felt like a reasonable response to fame. Several states away, Emily Dawson sat alone in her apartment watching the story spread. She cried twice that evening, once from relief, once from terror, because publicity protected whistleblowers. Until it didn't. Her apartment overlooked a parking lot outside Columbia, South Carolina. Small, modest, forgettable, exactly how she preferred it. For months, she had lived expecting retaliation. Now the investigation was public. There was no going back. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Emily froze, then answered. "Hello." A familiar voice replied. Marcus Holloway, the investigator from the Attorney General's office. "Miss Dawson." She swallowed. "Yes. We need to meet." Fear immediately returned. "Am I in trouble?" "No." Marcus paused. "Quite the opposite." The next morning, Emily officially provided a recorded statement. 6 hours long. Every detail, every email, every altered record, every suspicious payment, every pressure campaign. By the end, investigators possessed far more than a whistleblower complaint. They possessed a roadmap, and roads always led somewhere. 3 weeks later, the consequences arrived, one after another. State contract reviews, federal subpoenas, financial audits, employee interviews, contract suspensions. The machine Rebecca described was finally being forced into daylight. Many people panicked. Some cooperated. Others resigned. Several quietly hired attorneys. One executive attempted to leave the country. That lasted approximately 16 hours before investigators intercepted him. Every development generated another news article, another interview, another public question. The pressure became relentless. Even Benjamin Carter seemed surprised by how quickly events accelerated. He sat across from Rebecca one evening, reviewing the latest developments. Stacks of paperwork surrounded them. The office looked increasingly like a command center. "Remember when this was about one dog?" Rebecca asked. Benjamin smiled faintly. Buster always was a terrible employee. The joke caught both of them off guard. Rebecca laughed. A real laugh. The first in weeks. Benjamin looked toward the photograph sitting on her desk. The picture showed Buster lying beside Ivy's couch. Sleeping. Actually sleeping. Not guarding. Not scanning. Sleeping. The image affected him more than he expected. Because he remembered Afghanistan. He remembered explosions. Helicopters. Body armor. The day Caleb Ross died. He remembered Buster standing beside the evacuation helicopter refusing to leave his handler. For soldiers had needed to physically carry the dog aboard. Benjamin never forgot that. Now the same dog slept peacefully beside a couch in Savannah. The contrast felt almost impossible. The phone interrupted his thoughts. Rebecca answered, listened, then slowly smiled. What? She covered the receiver. Marcus. Benjamin straightened. The investigator's update lasted only 2 minutes. Then Rebecca ended the call. The smile remained. Well, Rebecca leaned back. Victor Hale has been officially summoned for questioning. Silence filled the room. Not shock. Not celebration. Something quieter. Something deeper. Vindication. Because powerful people rarely faced consequences. At least not immediately. Yet here they were. Victor Hale. Summoned. Questioned. Forced to answer. Benjamin stared at the paperwork spread across the desk. The complaints. The threats. The missing records. The altered files. The intimidation. The pressure. All of it had started because an exhausted nurse walked into an auction warehouse and refused to leave without a forgotten dog. Sometimes history changed through elections. Or wars. Or legislation. Sometimes it changed because one ordinary person decided that abandoning something loyal felt wrong. Outside, evening settled over Savannah. Inside her apartment, Ivy sat beside Buster near the window. The old dog watched the sunset paint gold across the live oak branches. For once, he seemed peaceful. Not healed. Not entirely. But peaceful. Ivy rested a hand against his shoulder. Months earlier, she had arrived at an auction carrying barely $4,000 and more hope than common sense. Now investigations were spreading across multiple states. Journalists were uncovering corruption. Veterans were speaking out. Officials were asking questions. And Victor Hale was finally being forced into the light. Buster leaned slightly against her leg. The movement was small, easy to miss. But Ivy noticed. She always noticed. And for the first time since this journey began, she allowed herself to believe something impossible. Justice might actually be coming. Victor Hale arrived at the federal building in Atlanta on a gray December morning that smelled faintly of rain and cold concrete. For nearly 20 years, Victor had entered government buildings as a respected contractor. A partner. A donor. A man whose phone calls were returned quickly. A man who sat on advisory boards, attended charity galas, sponsored veteran events, and appeared in photographs beside elected officials. This time felt different. No cameras waited outside. No reporters shouted questions. No dramatic spectacle unfolded. The danger was quieter than that. The danger was inside. Waiting. Victor stepped from a black sedan, wearing a charcoal overcoat tailored perfectly across his broad shoulders. At 60 years old, he remained physically imposing. Silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples. His jaw remained strong. His posture remained confident. Yet something had changed over the past month. The certainty that once surrounded him had begun to crack. Not publicly. Not yet. But privately. He knew. Men like Victor always knew when control was slipping away. Inside the conference room, Marcus Holloway waited with 2 attorneys and 3 investigators. Boxes of records sat stacked against one wall. Folders covered the table. A television monitor displayed spreadsheets and contract records. The room looked less like an interview, more like an autopsy. Victor immediately understood the difference. For 6 hours, investigators asked questions. Precise questions. Questions that revealed how much they already knew. Questions about shell companies. Contract reviews. Payment authorizations. Internal communications. Retired military working dogs. Missing records. Deleted emails. Employee complaints. Whistleblower reports. Victor answered carefully. Professionally. Confidently. But every answer seemed to generate 3 new questions. By late afternoon, even Gregory Vance looked tired. That frightened Victor more than anything else. Gregory never looked tired. When the interview finally ended, Marcus Holloway closed his notebook. The investigator's expression remained unreadable. "I recommend you remain available." Victor forced a smile. "Of course." Marcus held his gaze for several long seconds, then simply nodded. The meeting ended. The investigation did not. Across the country, support continued growing. Justice for Buster had evolved beyond a social media slogan. Veteran organizations organized fundraising drives. Military working dog groups demanded legislative reviews. Several retired generals publicly supported reforms. Former handlers shared stories that had remained buried for years. Many of those stories sounded disturbingly familiar. Lost paperwork, questionable transfers, dogs separated from handlers, retirement programs operating without proper oversight. The deeper journalists looked, the more questions appeared, and every road seemed to lead back toward the same network. Meanwhile, life inside Ivy Morgan's apartment continued in wonderfully ordinary ways. The Christmas season arrived in Savannah. Lights appeared along historic streets. Storefront windows filled with decorations. Church choirs practiced late into the evening. Tourists wandered beneath Spanish moss wrapped in white lights. For the first time since Buster entered her life again, Ivy experienced several consecutive weeks without a crisis. The sensation felt almost suspicious. Buster changed too. Not suddenly. Healing never happened suddenly. Healing happened in tiny moments. The first time he slept through an entire night. The first time he ignored fireworks in the distance. The first time he stopped checking every window before lying down. The first time he chose comfort over vigilance. Each moment seemed small. Together they meant everything. One evening Ivy returned from work to discover Buster asleep on the couch. Actually on the couch. His head rested against a pillow. One paw hung over the edge. The old dog looked embarrassed when he realized she had caught him. Ivy laughed so hard she nearly dropped her bag. "You finally surrendered." Buster immediately climbed down. Dignity restored. Or at least attempted. The following week, Mrs. Elaine Whitcomb brought over a knitted Christmas stocking with Buster's name stitched across the front. The 73-year-old landlord presented it with great ceremony. "There," she announced. "Now he's officially family." Buster sniffed the stocking, then looked at Mrs. Whitcomb, then at Ivy, then back at the stocking, as if trying to determine whether family came with paperwork. Mrs. Whitcomb adored him. The feeling appeared mutual, though Buster would never admit it. While Savannah enjoyed holiday lights, the investigation continued accelerating. Subpoenas uncovered additional records. Financial audits expanded. Former Sentinel employees began cooperating, some voluntarily, some after realizing investigators already possessed most of the evidence. Emily Dawson remained one of the most important witnesses. The months of fear had taken a visible toll on her. Yet every time investigators needed clarification, she showed up. Every time attorneys asked questions, she answered. Every time she considered walking away, she remembered Buster's photograph from the auction file. The dog officially reported dead. The dog who somehow survived long enough to expose everything. The image strengthened her resolve. By February, for months after Sarah Whitaker's first article, the situation became impossible for Sentinel Defense to contain. Several public contracts were officially suspended. Shareholders demanded answers. Board members resigned. Internal communications surfaced showing executives discussing strategies for reputation management and stakeholder pressure responses. The language sounded corporate. The intentions sounded familiar. Rebecca Stone spent countless hours reviewing new evidence. Her office remained crowded with paperwork. But the atmosphere had changed. Hope replaced uncertainty, not because victory was guaranteed, because the truth no longer stood alone. One rainy afternoon, Marcus Holloway visited Savannah personally. The investigator looked even more tired than usual. Months of interviews had added fresh lines around his eyes. Yet satisfaction lingered beneath the exhaustion, the kind that appeared when years of experience finally encountered enough evidence. Marcus joined Rebecca, Benjamin, and Ivy around a conference table. For a few moments nobody spoke. Then Marcus placed a thick folder on the table. "What is it?" Ivy asked. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "Progress." Inside were summaries, findings, financial analyses, witness statements, timelines. The investigation had uncovered extensive misconduct, contract manipulation, record falsification, retaliation campaigns, improper financial relationships. The exact legal outcomes remained uncertain. Trials would take time. Appeals would take time. Justice always seemed slower than corruption. But the machine was broken. The system had been exposed. And exposure changed everything. Benjamin quietly turned pages. He stopped when he reached Buster's custody records. The old colonel stared at them for several seconds. Memories surfaced. Afghanistan. Caleb Ross. Dust storms. Helicopter blades. A younger dog running through chaos without hesitation. Benjamin closed the folder. For years he had carried guilt he rarely discussed. Not guilt for Caleb's death. War rarely offered clean alternatives. The guilt came afterward. The assumption that someone else would ensure Buster received the care he deserved. The assumption that systems worked. The assumption that loyalty would be repaid. Looking at the evidence, Benjamin realized how wrong that assumption had been. Ivy noticed. "You okay?" Benjamin nodded once. Getting there. It was the most honest answer he could give. Spring arrived early that year. Savannah warmed. Flowers returned. The live oak outside Ivy's apartment filled with new leaves. One Saturday morning, nearly 6 months after the auction, Ivy sat on a park bench overlooking the river. Buster rested beside her. Children played nearby. Tour boats moved slowly across the water. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. For years, Buster's life had been defined by missions. Transfers, kennels, handlers, paperwork, conflict. Now he watched pigeons, and sunshine, and people, the ordinary world. A teenage boy approached cautiously, maybe 14 years old. Freckles, brown hair, nervous smile. "Excuse me." Ivy looked up. The boy pointed toward Buster. "Is that him?" She smiled. "Depends." "The dog from the article?" "Yes." The boy brightened. "My dad served with military working dogs." He hesitated, then reached into his backpack. A folded photograph emerged. Old, worn, carefully preserved. The picture showed a younger military dog standing beside a soldier. "My dad's partner." The boy swallowed. "He died a few years ago." Ivy studied the photo. Then the boy. Then Buster. The old Malinois quietly sniffed the photograph. Something softened in the boy's expression. For several minutes they talked. Nothing extraordinary. Just stories. Memories. Questions. When the boy finally left, Ivy watched him disappear down the path. Then she looked at Buster. "You know," she said softly, "you've helped a lot of people." Buster responded by watching a squirrel. Humility remained one of his strongest qualities. 2 months later, Justice for Buster officially became a non-profit organization. The idea originated during a late-night conversation between Ivy and Benjamin. At first it seemed impossible. Neither possessed experience running a national charity. Neither wanted attention. Both possessed full-time responsibilities already. Yet requests kept arriving. Veterans asking for help. Retired handlers seeking resources. Families trying to adopt former military dogs. Organizations offering support. The need was real. Too real to ignore. Rebecca handled legal formation. Several veteran groups offered funding. Donations arrived from across the country. Large donations. Small donations. $5. $50,000. Every contribution carried the same message. Do better. The organization focused on retired military working dogs. Medical care. Rehabilitation. Adoption support. Emergency placement. Advocacy. Exactly the services Buster should have received years earlier. The first rescue involved 2 retired dogs in Oklahoma. Then 3 in Arizona. Then another in North Carolina. The work expanded rapidly. Exhausting. Meaningful. Necessary. One evening, nearly 6 months after the auction, the founding board gathered in Savannah. Benjamin attended. Rebecca attended. Emily Dawson attended for the first time without looking over her shoulder every 30 seconds. Sarah Whitaker came too. So did Dr. Amos Keene. Nora Bell. Mrs. Whitcomb. Even Margaret Sloan drove down from Charleston. The gathering took place in the courtyard behind the bakery. String lights hung overhead. Music played softly. People laughed. A table overflowed with food. No speeches had been planned. Which guaranteed speeches would happen. Eventually Benjamin stood. Everyone quieted. The old colonel looked uncomfortable. Commanding troops had always been easier than expressing emotions. His gaze settled on Buster. The dog lay beneath a table enjoying a stolen piece of chicken from Mrs. Whitcomb. Benjamin smiled. "A rare sight." "You know," he began. For a long time I thought this story was about justice. He paused. It is. Then he looked toward Ivy. But I think it's also about responsibility. The courtyard remained silent. Benjamin continued. Good people kept assuming someone else would help. His eyes returned to Buster. And eventually one person decided not to assume anymore. Ivy immediately looked away. She hated being the center of attention. Everyone noticed. Everyone smiled. Buster lifted his head, unconcerned. As usual, the evening continued. Stories were shared. Plans were made. Laughter echoed beneath the lights. Life moved forward. Later that night, everyone left. The courtyard emptied. The city quieted. Savannah settled beneath stars. Inside the apartment, Ivy turned off the kitchen light and walked toward the living room. Buster already occupied his favorite place. Beside the window. The same window overlooking the live oak. The same window he had guarded relentlessly when he first arrived. Now he simply watched. No tension. No fear. No expectation of danger. Just curiosity. The moonlight silvered the fur around his muzzle. Age showed more clearly these days. Gray hairs. Stiff movements. Slower steps. The years could not be erased. Neither could the scars. But something else had changed. For the first time in a very long time, Buster belonged somewhere. Ivy sat beside him. Together they watched the darkness beyond the glass. A distant street lamp glowed softly. Branches moved in the night breeze. The city slept. The war was over. The investigations continued. Court proceedings remained ahead. Appeals remained ahead. Work remained ahead. But the battle that mattered most had already been won. Buster was home. No kennel. No cage. No chain. No auction. No uncertainty. Home. The old dog slowly lowered himself onto the floor and rested his head against Ivy's foot. A simple gesture. Trust. Belonging. Peace. Ivy smiled and looked toward the horizon where the first hints of dawn would eventually appear. 6 months earlier, she had walked into a warehouse carrying $4,000 and a stubborn refusal to abandon a forgotten dog. She never intended to start a movement. Never intended to expose corruption. Never intended to become part of a national story. She only wanted to help. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes one act of kindness altered far more lives than anyone could predict. Outside the window, the first faint glow of morning began touching the edge of the sky. Buster watched it arrive. Not from behind steel bars. Not from inside a transport crate. Not from a concrete kennel. From home. And for the first time in many years, that was exactly where he belonged. Sometimes God's greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder from heaven or signs written across the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through ordinary people who choose compassion when it would be easier to walk away. Ivy Morgan never set out to expose corruption, challenge powerful people, or start a movement that would spread across the nation. She simply saw a forgotten military dog and refused to abandon him. One act of kindness became the beginning of something far greater. Hidden records were uncovered. Truth was brought into the light. Justice reached people who had nearly lost hope. And a loyal dog named Buster reminded everyone that faithfulness, courage, and love are never wasted. That is often how God works in our lives. He does not always choose the most powerful people. He does not always work through the loudest voices. Sometimes he works through ordinary men and women who simply decide to do what is right when nobody is watching. A small act of kindness can change a life. One courageous decision can expose years of darkness. One person willing to stand firm can inspire countless others to do the same. Most of us will never uncover a corruption scandal or become part of a national investigation. But every day we face smaller choices that matter just as much. We choose whether to help someone who is struggling. We choose whether to speak the truth when it is uncomfortable. We choose whether to show kindness when no one expects it. Those choices may seem small in the moment, but God often uses small acts to accomplish extraordinary things. Buster finally found a home. Ivy found a purpose she never expected. And countless retired military dogs received a second chance because one person refused to look away. That is a reminder that even when the world feels difficult, God is still at work. We may not always see the entire plan, but every act of compassion matters. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what part of Buster's journey impacted you the most. And if you enjoy stories of faith, hope, courage, and second chances, Please subscribe and join our community. May God bless you and your family with peace in difficult times, strength when life feels heavy, wisdom to do what is right, and hope for every tomorrow. May He watch over your loved ones, guide your steps, and remind you that no act of kindness is ever forgotten.